Ancient medicine, pioneer travel, random acts of violence. All of these have an odd but ever-occurring theme. Man turning on man. From desperation to depraved fantasy, there is no history without cannibalism. And what's more human than consumption? This is the Cannibalism Iceberg. If this isn't your first time with me covering cannibalism, then we're definitely going to be hitting a few topics we've discussed before, but fear not, there are far more that we have not had a chance to discuss. And if this is your first time with me, welcome, because I don't think there's anyone who's talking more often, passionately, and long form than me about cannibalism. So with that, I don't want to waste any time because we are in for a long haul today, just you and me, so buckle in. And once again, I gave a warning before, but I'm going to be discussing some of the most disgusting acts people have committed. Cannibalism, necrophilia, murder, assault, just general nastiness. So if that's something you don't think you can handle, exit this video and make sure to subscribe and go check out a paranormal video. With that, Tier 1. And I am going to be doing Tier 1 a bit out of order just due to the fact that I don't want to become so repetitive on topics I've already discussed on here, and I'm just going to sprinkle them throughout our new ones. Michael Rockefeller. Now, when people say eat the rich, they usually don't mean in the most literal sense, but when it comes to Michael Rockefeller, which, yes, that Rockefeller, it became far more than literal. 23-year-old Michael, the great-grandson of one of the richest men in the world, went out to Dutch New Guinea, a large island off the coast of Australia, to make contact and get art from the Asmat people, a fairly uncontacted tribe, and create an anthropological display about the tribe within his father's museum. After a successful first attempt, he came for a second in November of 1961, where his boat ended up capsizing, forcing him to attempt to swim to shore, in which he was unsuccessful and ultimately drowned to death. Or at least that's what was initially believed. Michael was on the boat with a government anthropologist. It's estimated they were about 12 miles from the coast when the boat began giving out, to which he said, "I think I can make it." He proceeded to jump into the water, but never reappeared again. And being a Rockefeller, they used and paid for every option of searching. Helicopters, boats, planes, even his own father Nelson flying there to look for him. After 2 weeks of no sign of anything, they called off all searches and his death was ruled as a drowning. And for 53 years, this was never really questioned by the public past the initial tabloid rumors. This changed in 2014 when a reporter for National Geographic, Carl Hoffman, wrote in his book that during the actual investigation by the country after Michael's death, there was evidence provided that he was killed by the Asmat tribe and cannibalized. The most damning piece of evidence was a confession made to 2 Dutch missionaries who had been living with the Asmats for years speaking their language. They told the investigators that they heard straight from the tribe that some of them had killed Michael, seemingly in retaliation from a previous incident involving the Dutch. Beyond this, a police officer went to investigate the next year and said a skull was produced by the Asmat, saying it belonged to Michael. According to the story told, they speared him, then decapitated him, proceeding to open his skull to consume the brain. When the Asmat people were at war, a common practice was to do this to the skull of enemies. It's said that after they cooked and ate the rest of Michael, they later turned his bones into tools. There has been no publicly provided physical evidence for any of these claims, and the Rockefeller family still upholds themselves that Michael died from drowning. Headhunters. Headhunting itself refers to the practice of cutting the head off of individuals for a various amount of reasons, but more often than not, it carries spiritual meaning. Many believe that the soul of a person is held inside the head itself, so the removal of it will contain their being as well as strengthening it. This created a very strong talisman used for various things, from increasing fertility or the production of crops. This can be found all the way back into the Paleolithic era in Bavaria, with burial sites showing the heads being buried separate from the rest of the body, showing the clear division between the two. Now with cannibalism, this transfers to the concept of the head being important, which is why you would want to choose to eat that part of the body over others. Not all headhunters were cannibals, but of course, there were many cases that were. The Donner Party. The Donner Party was a group of pioneers who in 1946 began traveling to California from Missouri. They began taking the Oregon Trail, but ended up taking a newer shortcut referred to as Hastings Cutoff, which would be a deadly decision for the group. They became trapped in Nevada during an early winter, losing wagons, resources, and just so much went wrong on this trip before this even occurred. But they became trapped, even eating their own shoes. In total, the Donner Party consisted of about 87 members, and by the end of this winter, only 48 would survive. The reason this many were able to survive was due to the practice of survival cannibalism. Now, with cannibalism, at least on my channel, we break it into two very simple overarching groups, and this is institutionalized cannibalism and survival cannibalism. Survival cannibalism is what it sounds like. You cannibalize others to survive, and this typically refers to necro-cannibalism, which is the cannibalism of a person who's someone that just died. You didn't kill them to cannibalize them, they're dead, you're eating them. Necro-cannibalism. All of this is very literal. On the opposite side, when we talk about institutionalized cannibalism, this is about cannibalism that is part of the institution. Let's say a tribe, a race, a religion, a group, an organization. It is part of the institution to eat other people, in whatever sense of the word that means. So it is not for survival, it is by institution or choice. It is a normality, whereas survival cannibalism is going to be an outlier. And apart from the Donner Party participating in survival necro-cannibalism, I think it's left out of the conversation a lot that they killed their two indigenous guides they brought along, and frankly didn't even just kill them, hunted them down and killed them because they realized they were going to kill and eat them. And I just feel like that's really left out a lot, and part of that is due to the fact that at first the Donner Party did deny any partaking in survival cannibalism because very taboo, not really something you want to say happened, but of course, over time, with many accounts, it is beyond proven factual that the Donner Party, in fact, did have to resort to survival necro-cannibalism. Along with that, these were large family groups in this pioneer, wagon brigade. It wasn't a lot of single men or random people, and I will say most of the single men were the first ones to get eaten. But when it became children or family members, they did kind of make a point to try to swap around family members so people weren't eating their own. But the Donner Party stands as probably one of the most historically prolific American survival cannibalism cases. Self-cannibalism. Auto-cannibalism or self-cannibalism is exactly what it sounds like. It is eating yourself. This can typically fall into three categories: a compulsive action from fingernail biting, scab eating, or even chewing on and consuming your own hair. It can be a total choice, such as eating the removed skin from body modification surgeries like scarification, or the infamous foot tacos as we will discuss later, where an individual has a body part necessarily medically amputated and proceeds to take the body part home to consume it. And finally, it has history being used as a form of torture and punishment as recent as in the 1990s in Uganda. A group of young adults had went to Sudan for consecration, where upon their return were arrested and had their left ear cut off and forced to consume it themselves for failing to listen to the words of the Quran. Jeffrey Dahmer. Old Jeff Dahmer is probably, I would argue, one of the most well-known or famous serial killer cannibals, and frankly became a part of modern pop culture lexicon, including references in Katy Perry songs. Sorry guys, Kane decided to start eating in the middle of us filming, so we're gonna wait for him to eat. Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killing, pedophile, cannibal, necrophile who killed 17 men and children from 1978 to 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer would lure men into his apartment, usually under the guise of taking them home from a bar and wanting to take pictures of them, and he would proceed to kill them, cannibalize them, necrophile their bodies, take pictures of doing all of this. He would eat their hearts, livers, biceps, piece of their thighs. Even when at his arrest, they found 2 entire human hearts in his fridge. As well, he would put their bodies into giant vats he kept within his apartment. It is one of the biggest reasons Jeffrey Dahmer was caught was the utter stench of human remains, decomposition, and death that reeked out of his apartment. And Jeffrey himself predatorily moved into a very low-income black neighborhood that he knew the police would show up, see a white guy, and go, oh, whatever, none of our business. Jeffrey Dahmer's cannibalization usually comes down to about 2 thought processes that he himself agreed were correct, and this was a need for power or control. All of this surrounds his entire childhood of how he had 2 pretty neglectful parents who frankly kind of just abandoned him at times. He's very lonely, he used to pick up roadkill, kill small animals. He had all the telltale signs of someone who would go on to serial kill. Along with this was the fact that he was extremely lonely and closeted about his sexuality. He had this desire for control, and on top of that, with all this loneliness, the desire to keep someone with him forever. He believed that if he ate these men, they would become a part of him. They would never leave him. They would stay around forever. Along with this, Jeffrey Dahmer also used to drill holes into victims while they were alive and pour in various chemicals trying to create some sort of, as he said, zombie who would never leave him and stay around forever. Jeffrey Dahmer stands as the focal point of serial killers becoming pop culture and the human fascination with cannibalism. Agori. The Agori are the last standing sect of a form of Shaivism that began in medieval India. Their practice has large ties to post-mortem rites and practices including rubbing cremated ashes into their skin, as well as creating tools from human remains, including skull cups, which are depicted in various religious works associated with certain Hindu gods. They as well participate in necro-cannibalism, believing in the spiritual power of consuming human flesh, from bringing eternal life to strengthening themselves, a very common spiritual belief we will see throughout this entire iceberg surrounding cannibalism. In one of, if not the only video documentation of the Agori, titled Feeding on the Dead, we see the group wait for a body to wash through the Ganges River, where occasionally people choose to be placed within instead of the common practice nowadays of cremation. In this short documentary, we see the leader pray to a god, offering some of the flesh of the body they came across before consuming a piece of the arm for themselves. Countess Bathory. Now, Countess Bathory is an extremely complicated historical figure that has kind of now become this mythos and crazy out of the world, almost cryptid of who she actually was. And there's actually kind of this ambiguity around how heinous she was. Was she truly this giant fiend for blood and killing young girls and everlasting beauty? Or was this all kind of a made-up scandal to take her property from her? It's very, very controversial, and I would love to do a deep dive about that with you, but in our case, we're taking Countess Bathory as she would be sung about by Venom, where she is a blood countess killing young girls. The Bathorys were one of the most powerful Protestant families in Hungary. With this, Countess Bathory herself started holding a sort of girls' schooling and workforce, and eventually whispers of odd disappearances and even dark practices happening at the Bathory estate started spreading in the early 1600s. Eventually in 1610, the Hungarian authorities themselves raided her castles and arrested the countess along with 4 of her servants. One witness described one of the scenes in the castle as a girl dead, a second almost dying in the most pitiful state, and others tied up half dead. The countess made no denials, the least of her crimes being the tortures administered to 50 other girls held prisoner in her dungeons. Rumors were spread of victims ranging from 36 to 600, but historians themselves believe it to be closer to 50. There were bloody torture items and corpses of young girls, but with the countess herself never standing trial and almost none of the court documents surviving, it isn't the clearest on what horrors actually took place at the Bathory Castle. And this has led to multiple tales throughout the years, the most common being that she used to bathe in bathtubs full of the blood of these young girls, but there's never been any evidence or documentation on the matter. Instead of ever being on trial or tried for her crimes like anyone else would be, including her arrested accomplices, who were all tried and killed but one, she got to remain imprisoned in one of her own castles until her death, where she was discovered dead on her own floor on August 21st, 1614, at the age of 54. Elisa Lam. The last video of Elisa Lam has become a part of internet history, intrigue, and conspiracy. Elisa Lam was staying at the Cecil Hotel, but Elisa was declared missing and eventually, unbeknownst to everyone, she proceeded to enter the elevator where she exhibited beyond odd behavior. She would press multiple buttons, she was going floor to floor on none of the ones she was staying. She would look out of the elevator as if seeing if someone was coming in or looking for someone, if she was hiding from someone. It's just very odd footage that became just a fascination to everyone. And part of that reason is the fact that Elisa would somehow end up in the water tank supply for the entire hotel. Theories surrounding what happened know absolutely no end. Some argue that the footage we see has been edited with the timestamps being tampered with, parts being sped up or slowed down, and entire chunks of minutes removed from it, either to protect someone themselves or someone who was visible, or that the person in charge of the footage was the one that killed Elisa themselves. She ended up in there, died, and began decomposing into the water that everyone in the hotel was bathing and drinking. Guests had been complaining about water pressure, as well as the taste and the appearance of it. This all led to the hotel eventually sending a maintenance worker to check the tank itself. And that is where they found Elisa, naked and rotting in the water. Her death was ruled a drowning, but the facts of how Elisa ended up on the roof, that can only be accessed by codes and keys, which she had none of, or was able to climb into the water tank herself at the height it was, that seems frankly impossible, and the fact that the water tank only opens and closes from the outside, are something that have never been answered and most likely never will be. It is worth noting, She was on psychiatric medication she was not taking at the time, which could be a reason for her odd behavior. But to this day, the entire fact that she somehow ended up in a water tank that seemingly you cannot close from the inside has created this giant conspiracy and craziness, and adds to the entire lore of this Hotel Cecil, which Richard Ramirez stayed there. It's a really weird, horrible place. As well, worth mentioning, one of my favorite authors actually wrote a short story called Dark Water that involved a mother staying with her child at an apartment complex where there was kind of weird stuff going on with this toy purse, and eventually the water's nasty, gross, and turns out a young girl who used to live there was dead in the water tank. And this came out years before the Elisa Lam incident. Hansel and Gretel. A now classic fairy tale follows the story of two siblings dumped into the woods by their parents during time of famine, which the story itself was most likely inspired by a real famine starting in 1314 as a result of the flooding in the British Isles that affected everyone from royalty to common folk, and eventually stirred up rumors of cannibalism. The fairy tale follows two children stumbling upon a cottage where a woman takes them in and then begins heating an oven up. The children realize that she has plans on cooking and eating the two, to which Gretel is able to trick the woman and push her into the oven instead. Most versions of this story now to refer to the woman being a witch and her home being made of candy to fatten the children up for eating. The story of Hansel and Gretel is a catalyst for an extreme amount of paraphilias, and especially of our conversation on the interest in cannibalism, and it will appear throughout this video, inspiring multitudes of cannibals. Long pig. Long pig is a slang term for human meat for consumption. There's been various ideas on where the term originated from. Possibly the fact that human meat tastes like pork, which on record from cannibals seems to be not the most accurate description. In a book released in 1883 surrounding cannibals, it stated that the expression long pig is not a joke nor a phrase invented by Europeans, but one frequently used by the Fijians, who looked upon a corpse as ordinary butcher's meat and call a human body puka balva, long pig, in contradiction to pukadina, or real pig. It is worth noting that the Isles of Fiji were referred to as the Cannibal Isles for a period of time with absolutely no facts or backing to it, and this could just be, once again, a reference to a racist, long-spread myth that people in the Fiji Isles were cannibals. As well, I've seen reference to an old tale of pigs being cursed humans. It is not completely known where the term truly comes from, but it is one of the most regularly used instances to refer to human meat being eaten by cannibals. Alfred Packer. Now, we have talked about Alfred before, typically referred to as the Colorado cannibal. He was the inspiration for the Cannibal the Musical film from Troma, which I am once again recommending to you. While working as a miner in Utah, Packer, as well as 21 other men, heard of a gold rush that was happening over in Colorado. He was put in charge, and they set out to go to get money, and 5 months later, almost every single man that Alfred Packer led would be dead but himself. When questioned about what happened to the other man, he just played dumb. He acted like he has no clue what happened. They abandoned him, and he had to, eat his own shoes. But, they kind of quickly smelled bullshit. Soon enough, they got Packer to agree to go back and help search for the other men in the area. And once he started getting grilled about all this money and the possessions, and that they thought that the other men were dead, Packer eventually broke down and said it would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry. To this day, it is heavily questioned what happened to Alfred Packer and the other 6 men. But one thing we know for sure is Alfred Packer ate his companions, either for survival or an even more horrifying choice: Ted Bundy. So if you're like me and you're kind of like, why is Ted Bundy on this list? I'll be real, there's a few entries on here that I personally would not have on here, and we're gonna cover those. A lot of them are serial killers. My guess is because Ted had a habit of post-mortem mutilation that at times involved teeth. To me, this makes him a Class 8 necrophile, which is necromutilomaniac, which we will be getting into later, because we're going to talk about the Red Ripper and Andre Chikatilo, so, hang in for that one. Ted Bundy was an American serial killer, necrophile, kidnapper, all-around horrible piece of shit, who killed women and children. Between 1974 to 1978, he admitted to 28 murders, but it is suspected to be far more. One of the biggest pieces of evidence that convicted Bundy and was used in court that he literally could not deny was bite marks he left into one of his victims, Lisa Levy, which was after a sorority attack. Now, I think this is the reason Ted is on this list, is because of the bite marks on the body as well. I believe on record, he did post-mortem bite the nipple off of one of his victims. Now, There's no evidence of him ever consuming human flesh, but, if you're ripping flesh post-mortem, you know what, why not just have you on here? Ted Bundy was obviously found guilty and sentenced to death by electric chair. If you'd like to hear more about Ted Bundy and his crimes and his groupies, watch my serial killer groupie phenomenon video. Wendigo. The Wendigo is an indigenous creature coming from the Algonquian that is rooted deeply into multiple belief systems, usually surrounding the concept of it possessing an individual, causing an insatiable hunger. Although it has variations on its description in different beliefs, it is recognized as a dark, cold, cannibalistic figure, often being the representation of starvation and greed simultaneously. No matter what it eats, the Wendigo is never satisfied, and as it grows with every meal, this can quickly be seen as a relation to the winter, the lack of food and crops, condemning greed and representing the harsh realities about surviving the winter when there isn't much food around. Many tribes would do ceremonies surrounding the creature during times of famine or low resources to once again help instill the importance of moderation for all. The Wendigo has now been taken and represented massively within modern American media, more particularly horror, with allegorical references into the television program Hannibal, entire film adaptations, and the ever-present existence of online short horror stories. Foot taco. A tale as old as time. You get with your homies, you start asking crazy hypothetical questions. Like, questions I pose you guys. Would you eat human flesh? If you had the option where it was consented to and it was just, it was there. Well, one Redditor and his friends asked this question. And they were able to answer it, because he got into a motorcycle accident that unfortunately required the amputation of his foot. Can you see where we're going with this? And he asked, the most important question, and a question I hope all of you ask, which is, can I keep it? And fortunately, the answer was yes. So on July 10th of 2016, he and 10 of his close friends, which I believe they noted it was 11 originally and someone backed down, which you can't fault them. 10 of his friends joined him for a dinner party in which they cooked his foot meat, fajita style, with peppers, so, a little flavor to the meat, and they all consumed his foot via tacos, which I guess that is a good way to consume human meat. In my head, I'm like, we're doing this sashimi style, but I guess this is definitely the move, and I know you're like, what did it taste like? Beef. They said it was very beefy, and that tasted good, but was an enjoyable experience, and that I think he said one of his friends had to spit him out into a napkin, which, tale as old as time. And here's the thing, guys, we gotta relish and we can have some fun moments in this, because most of this video is not gonna be fun, so, let's just enjoy our little bit of foot taco-ness, and I think he even said that this was actually really good for him to process the loss of his foot, so, a lot of pros out of foot tacos. From Hell letter. This is a letter that was said to have been sent from Jack the Ripper, stating, "From Hell, Mr. Lusk, Sore, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you, t'other piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you will only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." And the letter was indeed accompanied with the half-eaten kidney. And the Mr. Lusk it was sent to was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, who was working on attempting to identify and stop the Ripper. Like all correspondences said to be from Jack the Ripper, this was divided in belief of authenticity. Many people faked letters for one reason or another, people wanting attention, or even journalists wanting more to the story. But the largest reason this letter is held in regard of being possibly more real than the others is the fact that one of the victims, Catherine, was found to have had her kidneys removed by the Ripper. On the other side, there was the option that the organ came from a medical student who would have had access to organs, especially with the facts that was determined after being inspected that the kidneys appeared to have been preserved in spirits. Even Lusk at first believed it to have been a hoax and didn't report it to the police until he was urged by others. Of course, to this day, it's still unknown if the letter was in fact sent by the Ripper, but it is the letter that is held in regard of being more real than not. Soylent Green. Soylent Green was a 1973 film based off a 1966 novel by the name Make Room, Make Room. It's a dystopian set world in the year of 2022. Everyone's suffering from the negative impacts of overpopulation, pollution, low resources. In this, we're following a murder investigation in New York, where only the top percent have homes, which they protect through various means. The general public who are forced to live in squalor, feeding off the supplied food from the Soylent Company, consisting of Soylent Red and Yellow. But the company introduces a brand new Soylent Green that tastes much better, claiming it to be made from plankton. Through research, the lead detective and his colleague come to the conclusion that with the state of the environment, there's absolutely no way there's enough plankton to be producing Soylent Green to the population. And our lead detective's colleague comes to this correct conclusion that Soylent Green is actually made of people. Horrified, he goes to a medically assisted death facility, and his final words are his findings to our lead detective, who then goes on a mission to reveal the truth. Ultimately, he gets severely shot during his fight against the Soylent Company, and as he's being wheeled off by paramedics, he screams to everybody, "Soylent Green is people." Miracle of the Andes. This is in reference to Air Force Flight 571. The flight was from Uruguay to Chile and ultimately crashed into the Andes mountain range in Argentina. This was due to the extremely poor choices of an inexperienced pilot who thought they had missed the turning point, while in reality, this was not the case, and he essentially flew the plane directly into the mountain range, ripping off the wings and end cone. The flight in total had 45 passengers, including 19 members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, as well as their family and friends aboard. Search and rescue planes were sent for 8 days searching for the crashed plane and any survivors. Unfortunately, they were unable to make out the white plane against the heavy snowfall, and the search was called off. The survivors of the crash were there for 72 days, which ultimately, between the freezing temperatures, starvation, and even an avalanche, would kill another 13 passengers. 11 of these were members of the said rugby team. The survivors were forced to practice survival necrocannibalism of those that had perished. 2 of the men, Nando and Roberto, realized that the only way to get help would be if they went out for it. So the 2 men bravely climbed the crash site for 3 days and spent another 7 more trekking until they ultimately reached Chile and successfully got rescued. Ultimately, the final 14 survivors of the plane crash spent 2.5 months on the crash site, forced to eat their friends, and without the 2 men trekking out, they may have never been found. Ed Gein. And once again, this is an instance of where someone listed on here is in fact not a cannibal on the record. And I know you're already jumping to comments that Ed Gein was totally a cannibal, but I urge you to take like 5 seconds to look at 3 separate reliable resources. There's no evidence Ed Gein ever cannibalized anybody at all. It is a very large common misconception that he was eating people, but he was just an enthusiast for flesh, which, great band name. But Ed Gein was an American killer and grave robber and craftsman. He had a very disturbing relationship with his mother, and he was extremely mentally unwell, in part due to a lot of that. And once she died, Ed kind of didn't have anyone keeping him in check on anything, and he had boy, did I say he had a weird relationship with his mother? He then would proceed to dig up women that reminded him of his mother, take them home, and create various things out of their flesh, including face masks, chest plates, nipple belts. It is on record he says he did not necrophile anybody because they smelled too bad. And as well, he, there was, I believe, the reason people think he necrophiled people was I think he had organs in the fridge. I want to say that's what it is. I'll put it up here. I'm so sorry. I'll be so real with you guys. This one I didn't go too crazy on it because I'm like, I unfortunately know too much about Ed Gein. But, put that on my Tinder. But Ed, was arrested and put into a mental health facility until the ends of his days, and he became a giant inspiration for horror. American Psycho's inspired by him. Silence of the Lambs, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, there are so many movies that have direct inspirational ties to Ed Gein and all of the crimes he did with people's bodies post-mortem. Kuro. Many people refer to this as the mad cow disease of cannibalism, that eating your own makes you ill, but it is actually far more complicated than that. Endocannibalism is when you're eating one of your own, part of your community. A lot of this is going to be funerary cannibalism. In particular, I'd like to stuff the 4 people of Papua New Guinea, where they actually, unfortunately, were victims of a neurodegenerative disease that derives from eating infected protein of humans, the prions that are in the brain, and led to a new disease being formed called Kuro. Practices of the 4 people were that deceased family members were traditionally cooked and eaten, which was thought to help free the spirit of the dead. In particular, the brain was eaten by women and children, which led to the spread of the disease, which would eventually shut down the body completely. The disease would start showing itself with tremors, and eventually you would start losing control and ability of your entire body, just slowly breaking the brain down. The practice of funerary cannibalism was actually quite common in a lot of tribes due to this kind of last final act of devotion or love to your individual. You are freeing them in a way, so it was one of the last ways to show love to your loved one. Luckily, there were people that came into the tribe and were able to figure out it was essentially the funerary cannibalism that was causing this disease. So even though it took about 10 to 50 years to officially eliminate out of the populace, they stopped in the 1960s of their funerary customs, and the disease no longer started spreading within their tribe. Now to us, the concept of eating your loved one, especially with a lot of Western culture around funerals, probably seems like a very insane, crazy thing to do, but there is a lot of relation between cannibalism and love. Franklin Lost Expedition. In 1845, an expedition of 129 men left Great Britain for the Canadian Arctic, searching for the Northwest Passage, going across 2 boats. Ultimately, the ships and men would disappear, going without Britain's notice for almost 3 years. They sent out multiple search parties to no avail, and within the next 5 years, they only came across 3 unmarked graves, and some of the crew's belongings were found on an uninhabited piece of ice. Rumors around the group resorting to cannibalism had been prevalent since the news of their disappearance, but with a new analysis of 35 bones by anthropologists Simon Mays and Owen Beatty, now over 100 years later, it does suggest that the men did indeed eat one another. The bones they analyzed show signs of being broken and heated, so the crew members most likely cooked them to extract the bone marrow, which is an act of end-stage cannibalism. Survival cannibalism usually takes place within stages, starting with eating the large muscle groups and continuing to escalate to smaller, harder-to-eat areas out of desperation, until ultimately having nothing left but the marrow inside of the human bones to consume. Boone Helm. Boone, similar to Packer, was kind of this Wild West gold rush pioneer cannibal guy, except for the fact that Boone explicitly killed people for fun. He's described as American historian as, quote, bad. Nothing in the world could ever have made him anything but bad. He was, by birth and breeding, low course, cruel, animal-like, and utterly depraved. And for him, no name but ruffian can fitly apply. Boone had an extensive history of criminal mischief, disrespect, alcoholism, and violence. What began his entire spree of murder was the fact that the gold rush had came in and he wanted to go off and get money from it, partially due to his recent divorce from his wife he was drunkenly beating. One of his cousins agreed to go with him, and at the last minute back out. This made Boone so angry he went to his cousin and stabbed him to death and began his first fleeing from the law. He was captured and held accountable and put into a mental institution for some peculiar reason, and in this institution he ended up befriending a guard, who eventually would let him go on walks with him, and at one point, Boone convinced him to let him go on a walk in the woods, where Boone would flee the scene. He escaped and continued his way to California, and during this large trek, he came across multiple men, and frankly, it's unclear just how many men he ended up killing along the way, but it is definitely suspected to be upwards of at least 10 men, and most of the times when Boone killed people, he was truly doing it for the love of it. Eventually, word of him going around and murdering men on his escaped trek got around to people, so he then had to flee towards the west coast. And along his travels, he eventually picked up about 6 companions, all who were ruffians who would go and rob people and go from town to town, just frankly being criminals. And this actually would mark what was soon to be the start of his cannibalistic escapade. Boone even saying, quote, "Many's the poor devil I've killed at one time or another, and the time has been that I've been obliged to feed on some of them," unquote. Eventually, while these 7 men were on the run, they came into contact with Native Americans and got into a fight or scuffle with them, leaving them with very little provisions, to the point the men were forced to eat their own horses. Ultimately, it came down to only 2 of them living, Boone and a man named Burton. On the record, it is said that Burton was no longer able to continue the journey, and Boone left him at an empty cabin to continue on. Eventually, Boone himself was forced to double back after he realized he couldn't continue on without any food. He then found Burton within the shed with a self-inflicted wound. So Boone cut off his legs, ate one of them at the cabin, and wrapped the other one up in a spare clothing to take with him. He continued on his trek and of course murdering men senselessly along the way, including him having to flee from California once again for murdering a rancher he befriended. Once again, Boone just killed men to kill men. He fled to Oregon, where he robbed and murdered someone in 1862, and he was finally held accountable after being arrested for gunning a man down in a saloon. That was until Boone's brother showed up and paid them off. And of course, Boone would not stop killing, and this led him in Texas, getting involved with a gang of men, once again, just murdering and robbing people. It was finally there that he was apprehended. He was ultimately sentenced to death, which after hearing this, he simply said, I've looked at death in all forms, and I am not afraid to die. Boone Helm, outside of being the Kentucky Cannibal, is one of the earliest serial killers on record, and particularly someone who just killed for the hell of it. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, undeniably, is one of the most disgusting humans that has ever probably walked the earth, and one of the most disturbingly perverse individuals, to the point that, I said in the Murder Billy video, I can't really talk to you at super extensive lengths about what he did, and I'm going to try to cover to you as much as I can right now, more particularly one case that is absolutely the reason he's on this list. Albert Fish was an American serial killer, rapist, pedo, and cannibal who killed at least 3 children over the span of 4 years. As a child, Albert ended up in a state-ran orphanage where he says he began his association with pain and enjoyment, even eventually giving himself his own beatings, and more particularly, he would insert needles into his own groin. He became obsessed with torture and assault against children, later saying that God was commanding him to torture and consume young children. He was searching in the paper for listings of young men looking for housework, which is where he found himself at the Budd home, introducing himself as Frank Howard. He claimed he had a farm in upstate New York that he needed a work boy for, discussing with Edward Budd hiring him, who was his initial target, until he saw 10-year-old Grace Budd, to which his plan shifted. He claimed he was in town for the birthday party of his niece and asked if he could take young Grace with him. They obliged, and Grace was never seen again. After 6 years of her disappearance, a letter was sent to her mother. This last portion of the letter is as follows. On Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I'd already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and I called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death. Then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not her, though I could have, I wished. She died a virgin. After his arrest and trial, Albert Fish was sentenced to death by electrocution, where he allegedly helped put the electrodes on his body. His last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." Albert wrote pages of final words that his lawyer refused to give out, saying, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." I will say, there is a screamo band, an old screamo emo band that used a reading of his letters as an interlude or an opener or ender to a song or something, and for the life of me, I can't find out who it is, and I obviously can't remember, so if you remember who it is, please comment it down below. Saturn devouring his son. The painter Goya had 14 works referred to as the Black Paintings. These were painted onto the walls of his home during 1820 to 1823, never intended to be seen by anyone else. Eventually, these were transferred to canvas and placed within museums. One of the most famous of these is the depiction of the Greek myth Kronos, or referred to as Saturn by the Romans, eating one of his children after being told a prophecy that one of them would overthrow him. But as these being one of the Black Paintings, it was never formally titled or left with any description at all by Goya, and is purely left up to interpretations, including it having absolutely no relation to Saturn, and being purely allegorical to various topics. Either way, it is a brutal depiction of human consumption. Essex whaling ship. I don't think there are any other sailing stories that are a better telltale of when to turn back and when to know things are wrong and when to just trust your gut and not go on the trip, like the Essex whaling ship. It set sail on August of 1819 with 21 men on board, led by a first-time captain. It was to be a 3-year trip, but they encountered issues just 2 days in, when an intense squall hit, knocking the boat temporarily on the side, partially damaging the Essex and resulting in the loss of 2 of its whaleboats. The captain himself initially wanted to turn back around, but he was convinced by the first mate to continue on, a choice that would prove absolutely fatal. It wouldn't be until 2 months in they finally saw their first whale. By September of 1820, almost a year in, the men had been fairly successful, catching over 10 whales and stopping at the Galapagos Isles, collecting about 200 tortoises. The following month, while repairs were being made to the ship, a male sperm whale believed to be 85 feet long, which a typical one is 65 feet long, slammed into the ship for seemingly no reason, destroying the Essex and leaving only 3 whaling ships. That was all that was left for the men. The captain himself advised that they should head to Society Islands, which were about 1,200 miles away from where they were, which ironically, 2 of the men refused under the guise of fear of cannibals at the island, which, once again, I discussed this in the first video, but here's a little refresher. The word cannibal actually, unlike other words, doesn't have a Greek or Latin rootage to it. It actually comes geologically from the Isles of Caribs, the Carib Islands, where explorers said tales that there were these horrible, savage cannibals on these islands, and you should not go over there because they will eat you. Now, this actually, systematically, is proven to not be true. There were not actually cannibalisms or cannibals taking place over there, but because it was the Caribs, it was Caribal, and over time it became Cannibal. And this rumor was completely false, but so prevalent that these men were too fearful to go to isles near them for their own safety, which ironically would in turn lead to the cannibalism between each other. The 2 men insisted on Peru or Chile, which was an entire 4,000 miles away and a beyond treacherous path to take. Soon enough, they ran out of food and resources, and on January 10th, 1821, the first man died on one of the boats. He was put to burial at sea, and then 10 days later, the second man would die. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that the men would make the ultimate choice of eating the now third man to die. Eventually, the 3 sailors left on this whale ship were rescued by a British ship after 89 days trapped at sea. The other ship fared far worse and more brutally, we can say, and this one took place with our captain on this ship. Between January 20th to 27th, 3 men died and were promptly cannibalized. Whereas on the other ship, the men waited about 3 weeks until the third death to occur to make the horrible choice of survival, the other ship very quickly turned to cannibalism. And after these 3 men died, next would be the first mate. The man who said they should continue the trek on after the first initial damage that the captain wanted to turn around for. Eventually, these 2 final whaleboats separated, and it's believed the one that did not hold the captain is actually 3 skeletons that were found on a separate island with a docked whale ship. It was never able to be fully confirmed, but it is pretty genuinely believed that those men are those skeletons. With the last men facing death by starvation, they decided to draw straws on who would be killed for food. It was the captain's teen cousin who caught the short end of the stick. The captain himself tried to switch spots with him, but the young man refused. He was then killed and eaten on January 6. 5 days later, another man on the ship died, leaving only 2 of them. They also ate and cannibalized this man. Eventually, they were found by fellow American whaling ships. This is one of the most intense and documented cases of maritime cannibalism and directly influenced the writing of Moby Dick. Miami Zombie. On May 26th of 2012, a man, Rudy Eugene, would attack another random innocent man, Ronald, accusing him of stealing his Bible. The men had met on one previous occasion, but were very far from even the word of acquaintance with each other. Rudy first approached the other man in a passive manner, complaining about not being able to score anything, and then all of a sudden, he kind of started getting angry and saying, "We're both gonna die," and attacked the other man. Rudy stripped nude after walking the 3-mile causeway around downtown Miami, which is where he found Ronald. He proceeded to beat him, removing some of his clothing, and ultimately biting and attacking, mutilating his face. It is worth mentioning to you that there were no contents of human flesh found within his stomach during his autopsy, but he just started chewing off giant chunks of this man's face. This case often gets associated or even mixed up with a separate one under the guise of that Rudy was taking bath salts, but his toxicology report showed that there were no bath salts. In fact, there was only positive for cannabis and some unknown pills that they did not know what they were in his stomach, and the police even posed the idea that these were drugs they didn't have knowledge of at the time. It's believed the attack went on for a minimum of 18 minutes, according to surveillance footage. A cyclist, of course, because it's always cyclists or runners, came across the attack and called 911. A police officer arrived on the scene and he refused to stop the attack, leading to him being shot a total of 5 times to end his brutal mutilation on the other man. Ronald was taken to the hospital, and it is believed that 75 to 80% of his face was mutilated beyond recognition and, frankly, seemingly repair above the beard line, even gouging out his left eye. He went through multiple reconstruction surgeries, but unfortunately has become completely and totally blind due to the senseless attack onto him. As well as being permanently disfigured, he had to relearn how to do everything, even just putting his own clothes on every day. He was luckily granted to stay at the medical facility as he was a homeless man at the time, and he was there to stay indefinitely, and from what I've seen, it seems his quality of life has been absolutely way better with the help of the staff there. Omaima Ari Nelson. On Thanksgiving in 1991, 23-year-old Omaima Nelson killed her husband of 1 month, dismembered his body, cooked his decapitated head, fried his hands in cooking oil, and mixed his remains in with leftover turkey. Her husband Bill was 33 years older than her, an age gap larger than how long she had been alive. After seemingly knowing each other for just a few days, they decided to get married, which after their marriage, Omaima said that Bill started exhibiting extreme abusive tendencies towards her. And on Thanksgiving, he tried to rape and strangle her, to which in self-defense, she hit him with a lamp before proceeding to stab and kill him with a pair of kitchen scissors. After this, she dismembered and cooked parts of him, attempting to get rid of what she could of his corpse in the garbage disposal before wrapping up the remaining chunks of who was her husband into newspaper and garbage bags. She proceeded to drive to a friend's, attempting to have them help her dispose of the remains for $75,000. In turn of this, her friend immediately called the authorities. She was of course arrested, and when their apartment was investigated, the deputy district attorney said there were suitcases and plastic bags soaked with dark liquid from his body parts. In the fry cooker, there sat Mr. Nelson's hands, and when we opened the refrigerator, there was Mr. Nelson's head with stab wounds. About 130 pounds of Bill's body was never discovered. There's been a constant rumor that she cooked and ate his ribs, admitting to an attorney, but to this day, she upholds that she never ate any part of his body and is still serving her 28 to life sentence. The Rue Hunter. Joachim Kroll was a serial-killing cannibal necrophile in Germany who took the lives of at least 14 people over the span of 20 years. After working as a farmhand and seeing the slaughter of animals, it awoken something in him, along with him being self-deemed inadequate in bed with women. After the death of his mother, and separated from other family members, he killed his first victim, 19-year-old Irmgard Strell. He strangled, raped, and killed her, slashing her torso open. His next confirmed victim was 24-year-old Carla Tesmir. His attack was identical to his first, except for his new interest: cannibalism. He cut off pieces of flesh from her thighs and buttocks, taking them home with him to cook and consume. Joachim wouldn't cannibalize every single victim, only those he deemed young and tender enough. As well, when asked why he cannibalized at all, he said because meat was expensive. His spree came to an end in 1976 after kidnapping a 4-year-old girl from a park and ultimately clogging a shared bathroom with the little girl's internal organs, showing nothing even close to remorse. Even telling his neighbor when questioned what was clogging the toilet, he simply said, "guts." The police found parts of the body were in the refrigerator. A hand was cooking on the stove. And once arrested, he quickly confessed to 13 other murders and ultimately died in prison from a heart attack in 1991. Peter Bryan. Peter, sometimes called Peckish Pete in British media, was a 3-time murderer in London. In 1993, he beat Nisha, a 21-year-old woman, to death with a hammer, seemingly in relation to him being fired by her father. He was placed into a psychiatric facility as it was clear he was suffering from schizophrenia. In 2004, after being transferred from lower to lower security facilities, he was deemed able to be released back to the public. And just hours after this choice, Bryan killed, dismembered, cooked, and ate his friend Brian's brain. He was placed back into a psychiatric facility where he killed a fellow patient named Richard. And after this, he told the authorities that he wanted to kill and eat him as well. Our next two are both bouts of survival maritime cannibalism, which, that is so beyond prevalent within this, and I'm going to get in later to a lot of the rules and or customs of the sea surrounding this. SS Dahmer. On October 16th of 1918, during their initial voyage, the Dahmer boat was struck by lightning off the coast of Guam. completely destroying their ship and all of their cargo. All those on board were able to evacuate into 2 lifeboats and 1 raft. Although 5 passengers were rescued, the 2 lifeboats were initially containing 32 crewmen aboard. They were rescued 9 days later after the sight of the sinking ship. The boats drifted around for about 3 weeks across the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Philippine Islands. One of these boats quickly exhausted its freshwater supply, forcing the crew to construct a crude water desalinization technique, and eventually resort to cannibalism. The SS Ernmore. The SS Ernmore is hard to find much about, but it was a tramp steamer that sank during a storm in 1889, and the survivors drifted for 21 days in an open boat and were allegedly forced into cannibalism to survive. Francis Spaight. Francis Spaight was a transport ship from Ireland that regularly transported immigrants and timber to and from North America. But on one fateful voyage, on December 3rd of 1835, they were knocked off path from a snowstorm. While off the coast of Canada, of the 18 men, 3 were thrown off, along with all of their food rations. After 15 days, the captain suggested that they sacrifice one of the 4 young crew boys for the rest to eat, for survival. They eventually decided upon killing and eating a 15-year-old boy. The captain ordered the cook to kill the young crew boy. After being forced, he completely failed in the killing, to the point that the boy tried to slit his own wrists. Once again failing to do so, the captain had to step in and slit the throat of the young boy. They proceeded to cannibalize his body for 3 days, until 3 other men died on the ship, and they cannibalized them as well. Just as they were about to decide who to kill and eat next, they were seen by another ship, to which the surviving 11 crewmen began waving the cut-off hands and feet to garner attention. They were ultimately rescued, and so malnourished and dehydrated they had to be carried off of the boat. Utter Party Massacre. The Utter Party Massacre was an attack by Native Americans in February of 1816 that killed or captured 29 out of a group of 44 immigrants on a fork of the Oregon Trail in Washington Territory. 10 of the survivors were found on October 24th of that year, emaciated and eating the mutilated body of a fellow member of their party. Historian Charles Henry Carey described the attack as more atrocious than any that had preceded it. It is of note an extremely rare occasion when natives not only attempted but sustained a prolonged attack on encircled immigrant wagons. David Playpens. David, a man in the UK, got into a motorcycle accident resulting in him having his finger removed. He asked the doctor to take it home, where he then boiled it and ate the flesh of his own finger, keeping the bones. He posted a photo of the cooked finger onto Facebook, which I cannot show here. Blood jam. Another medicinal cannibalism occurrence as a secret third option for blood consumption. There's a recipe posted to make blood jam in the 1679 Franciscan Apothecary. The first step was to take blood, quote, from persons of warm, moist temperament, such as those of a blotchy red complexion and rather plump of build, unquote. The next step was to let it dry into a sticky mass, and after that, place it upon a flat, smooth table of softwood and cut it into thin little slices, allowing its watery part to drip away. When it is no longer dripping, place it on a stove on the same table and stir it to a batter with a knife. When it's absolutely dry, place it immediately in a warm bronze mortar and pound it, forcing it through a sieve of finest silk. When it has all been sieved, seal it in a glass jar. Renew it in the spring of every year. King's Drops. English King Charles II was an enthusiastic chemist with his own laboratory. He was reported to have paid £6,000 to a professor at a local college for a recipe for distilled powder skull, which therefore later became known as the King's Drops. This was popular for a variety of complaints and seems to have been often mixed into wine or chocolate. In at least one case, it was used as sort of a mother's little helper by a woman named Anne Dormer, who wrote in 1686 to her sister Lady Elizabeth Trumbull, "I apply myself to tend my crazy health, and keep up my weak, shattered carcass, broken with restless nights in unquiet days. I take the King's Drops and drink chocolate, and when my soul is sad to death, I run and play with the children." Luka Magnotta. If Luka Magnotta has no haters, I'm dead. I cannot stand Luka Magnotta. Like, within an inch of his measly life, I cannot stand him. He is nowadays probably most well known to people from the Netflix documentary called Don't Fuck with Cats, and there's a reason it was called that. Luka was desperate for fame or notoriety, or it seems anyone to just even look at his ugly little rat face. He would make fake fan pages of him, sign up for reality TV, kind of create this fake online persona, photoshopping himself into yachts. And you know what's really easy to get on the internet? Bad attention. And Luka is a psychopath, sociopath, I don't know, I'm not qualified to say what he is, but he definitely lacked empathy towards people and more particularly kittens. Luka created killing and torture videos of kittens online that the online animal activists began trying to track him down, which just egged him on further to keep making these just vile, disgusting videos. And these animal activists were actually able to identify him quicker than any police did, and they turned in all this information, and of course the police were looking into it, and they were doing stuff about it, but people don't really care about animal cruelty in the legal system, and especially at this time they just didn't give a shit. And these animal activists even said, he's gonna escalate, he's gonna do something worse, he's gonna do this to a person. And they were more than right. Luka in fact escalated, and not just escalated, filmed this escalation, creating a now infamous shock video titled One Lunatic, One Ice Pick that he himself would upload onto the now defunct Best Gore website. In this video, Luka mutilates and necrophiles the body of Jun, and then cuts his flesh with a fork and knife, as well letting a dog eat the flesh he has cut off. After this, he packaged up parts of Lynn, sending them off to police headquarters as well as news outlets. He then disposed of the rest of his body in a suitcase outside of his apartment and jumped onto a plane, fleeing the country under a fake identity. A worldwide manhunt ensued, tracking down Luka Magnotta, where he would ultimately be found in an internet cafe looking himself up. Luka, to this day, is still serving his sentence in prison in Canada, which I will say he was vaguely recently moved to a lower security prison, and is the same one that Paul Bernardo of the Ken and Barbie killers are housed in, which just think it's a little wacky. If you want to hear more in depth about Luka Magnotta and his crimes and capture, check out my stuff video. Sonny Bean. Sonny Bean was said to be the head of a family of over 40, all born out of incest. They were known for robbing, kidnapping, and the eventual murder and cannibalization of over 1,000 people, and said to have partially inspired the movie The Hills Have Eyes. Once caught, the townspeople were said to have been so horrified with the Beans' crimes that they demanded a worse punishment than death. So 21 of the Bean women were burned to death. The men were then dismembered and left to bleed out to die. Besides the story of Bean from 1755, there are absolutely no records to verify him or his family's existence at all. In all reality, it appears the story was created by an Englishman to sell books propagating slander against the Scottish people as brutes. Because what has the English done historically other than attempt to make other countries and people seem like savages, when they themselves have bloodied hands of massacre and oppression? Carroll Edward Cole. The entry about him on the Murderipedia says it best with, Carroll Edward Eddie Cole had a poor childhood and hated his mother. He learned to take this hatred out on innocent women, as he grew older, claiming that he felt he killed her through them. Referred to at times as the Barfly Strangler, he strangled 14 women to death, but have claimed to kill over 30. In 1971, Cole strangled Elise Louis Buck to death in San Diego. He was questioned, but ultimately let go. After this, he moved to Las Vegas, where he then strangled Kathleen Blum and necrophiled her corpse. The same fate fell to Bonnie O'Neill in San Diego and Marnie Cushman in Las Vegas in 1979. Cole had moved on to new stalking grounds in 1980, killing Dorothy King on November 11th and on the next night murdering Wanda Faye Roberts, both in Dallas, Texas. He even returned to King's home after killing Roberts and engaged in necrophilia with her corpse. Cole had been identified as being with Roberts on the night of her murder and was apprehended during an attack on a woman named Sally Thompson in her apartment. Unfortunately, the police were too late and Sally was dead upon their arrival. Cole was initially released from custody for the Thompson attack, but was soon arrested and confessed to killing 35 women, though it is suspected that many of these claims were blown out of proportion to benefit his insanity defense at his upcoming trial in Texas. Later, after being given a life sentence, his apparent wish was to be found guilty and sentenced to death in his subsequent Nevada trial. He did get his wish and was sentenced to death, which he replied with simply, "Thanks, Judge." Cole refused to appeal this charge in any way and was put to death in Carson City, Nevada on December 6th of 1985. Big Lurch. Big Lurch was the rap name of Antron Singleton, who was still serving a life sentence for murdering his 21-year-old friend while high on PCP and ultimately cannibalizing parts of her body. Her chest had been torn open and a 3-inch blade was found broken off into her shoulder blade. Teeth marks were found on her face and lungs, which had been torn from her chest. Eyewitnesses reported that when Singleton was picked up by police, he was naked in the middle of the street, covered in blood, staring at the sky. A medical examination performed shortly after his capture found human flesh in his stomach, which was not his own. Stanley Dean Baker. On July 13th of 1970, a hippie hitchhiker named Stanley Dean Baker was arrested in California for the murder of a Montana man who had stopped to give him a ride. When arrested, Baker had admitted to the police that he shot a man to death and cannibalized his body. More particularly, he had cut into the chest of the man, tore his heart out, and ate it. And once arrested and being patted down, they felt something in his pocket, to which he replied, "They ain't chicken bones, they're human fingers. I have a problem. I'm a cannibal." Baker was branded a hippie Satanist because he had a recipe for LSD and a copy of the Satanic Bible in his possession when arrested. After being arrested, he would tell officials and other inmates that he was a part of a blood-drinking cult in Wyoming. But ultimately, he did confess that his crimes were just the result of drug usage and had nothing to do with Satanism at all. Hayden Clark. Hayden Clark is a bizarre, sick man who only openly admitted to his crimes to his cellmate that visually he associated with Jesus Christ due to his beard and long hair. There are 2 confirmed victims tied to Clark, 23-year-old Laura Hotelling and 6-year-old Michelle Dorr. Hayden had a very disturbing childhood with claims his mother forced him to wear girls' clothing as a punishment and his father killing someone, as well as Hayden himself killing small animals. Later in life, while in culinary school, he was caught drinking a gallon of beef blood, which would foreshadow his crimes. Clark was the gardener of Laura's family, and after finding a matching bloody handprint on Laura's pillow, they were able to tie Hayden to her murder, in which he claims he was dressed in women's clothing, saying he was one of his alter egos, Kristen. When serving his 30-year sentence for Laura's murder, he told his cellmate about his killing of a 6-year-old girl, Michelle, who Hayden had stolen out of her own backyard while he was living 2 houses down. He had cut her throat open with a knife before drinking some of her blood and eating a piece of his flesh. In an odd, rare occurrence, Hayden's brother Bradfield also murdered and cannibalized a woman. It's an interesting point of nurture versus nature when you see 2 brothers with extremely similar crimes. Isa Sagawa. In 1981, while in school for France, Sagawa would lure his classmate Renee over under the guise of helping translate stuff for schoolwork, when in reality, he had planned to kill and cannibalize her body. He shot Renee in the neck and then necrophiled her body. He then tried to cannibalize her by biting her flesh off, and once he realized his teeth were not strong enough to do so, he went to the store and purchased a knife, where he then went back to the house and began mutilating her body for butcherment and consumption, which he took photos during all of this, because of course he did. And I will say, if you look into him further, there is a Vice documentary, a short Vice documentary about it, which is very good. They show the pictures in full warning looking into this, like, it is very graphic, and they are just very out there. He began eating her body raw and cooked, and after she began to start decomposing in his apartment, he stuffed her into 2 suitcases, attempting to just dump her on the street, but of course, her body was very quickly found, and he was arrested just 4 short days later. Now, the reason I think Sagawa has the most infamy or knowledge to people, I'm going to try to use the word infamous less, why he's more well-known to people, is the fact that he somehow got off. He kind of faced no legal repercussions for killing and cannibalizing and necrophiling a woman. During his trial in France, the judge deemed him legally insane. Now, this would transport him to a mental health facility or hospital or something of the likes, as we mentioned Ed Gein was in. He was not a French citizen, so he was deported back to Japan. The Japanese medical officials said, he's sane, he's literally just a pervert, a deviant pervert. But here's the issue with all of this now. So they say, you're saying you can't be here, you need to be tried. France, deeming him legally insane, had already dropped charges and sealed the case. So Japan had nothing to try him on. So ultimately, he ended up living the rest of his days out as a free man and this weird macabre F-list celebrity, which I think there was one filmmaker who should have used and abused him for some weird art piece, which frankly good. He killed and necrophiled a woman, but he just became this weird adult macabre star, and it was super bizarre. He is now dead, so that's Goes Cave. There's evidence from a cave found in Somerset that in 14,700 years ago, people were eating each other, and that they weren't eating people out of necessity, but as part of a ritual. Dr. Sylvia Bello, a museum scientist who investigates the evolution of human behavior, including funerary and cannibalistic practices, said, "The evidence at Goes Cave points to a sophisticated culture of butchering and carving human remains. Prehistoric human remains belonging to several individuals that, including a teenager and a child around 3 years old, were found within the cave, showing clear signs of cannibalism. Many of the bones were chewed on by humans. Long bones and rib bones had been cracked open and gnawed to extract marrow and grease, whereas others showed cut marks where the soft tissue had been meticulously removed. On top of the cannibalization, there was evidence that 3 skulls were carefully shaped to use as cups and bowls." Jamestown. The Jamestown colony was founded in 1607 by 104 settlers, with only 38 surviving the first 9 months. Later on, in 1609, after multiple supply trips, including new settlers arriving, there would be about 500 Jamestown settlers at the start of the winter. But by the spring of 1610, there would only be 61 left. The time period of this is now referred to as the starving time, and the president of Jonestown at the time said, quote, "And now famine beginning to look gasoline pale in every face, that nothing was spared to maintain life, and to do those things which seem incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves, and to eat them. And some have licked up the blade, which hath fallen from their weak fellows." Unquote. In 2012, archaeologists discovered an area containing butchered bones of animals and dogs, which is a recognized extreme point of famine culturally. And along in this pit, they would also find partial skull fragments and human teeth. To a 14-year-old girl they have named Jane, who showed clear signs of cannibalism onto her bones. The physical anthropologist Douglas Owsley, who's had extensive work with cannibalized bones, including victims of the American serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer, has said, "It seems they most likely ate her brain first with how quickly it decomposes, then her tongue, cheeks, and leg muscles. It also appears that there's more than one individual involved in the post-mortem dismemberment and eating, as whoever separated her head did not have any experience in butchering of any kind, whereas the cuts found on her shin bones show a very large level of knowledge." It's not totally clear on why Jane in particular was butchered and eaten, or kind of anything surrounding it, but as this was the starving time, it is believed it was survival cannibalism, and it involving multiple people kind of shows her body was used to feed multiple people in the settlement at the time. Now, this, once again, is a very rare instance of survival cannibalism taking place in early times. Durangel Vargas. Vargas was a serial killer cannibal in Venezuela. He was a homeless man who used to hunt passerbys at a park, and once arrested in 1999, he confessed to the murder and cannibalization of at least 10 men in the span of 2 years. During the 90s, people that lived near the park began filing family members as missing. So in 1995, the police began to search the area under the bridge of the park. This is where he lived in the bushes by. After a brother of one of the missing people said that he had been last seen drinking with Vargas and talking to the man, they soon start searching near him and found the corpses of several men. When speaking to the media, he said, "Anyone can eat human flesh, but you have to wash and garnish it well to avoid diseases. I only eat the parts with muscle, particularly thighs and calves, which are my favorite. I make a very tasty stew with the tongue, and I use the eyes to make a nutritious and healthy soup." The Maisonette. On May 19th of 1884, 4 men boarded the Maisonette, a small yacht, to sail it from Southampton to Australia for the buyer of the boat, not knowing the horrifying fate that was ahead of them. Less than 2 months in, on July 5th, the boat was sunk by a massive wave, leading the men to having to escape to the dinghy with no resources except for a 1-pound tin of turnips one of them was able to grab. After spending 10 days rationing the tin between all 4 men and drinking their own urine, they were put out of any other option. One of the men had been drinking copious amounts of seawater, becoming ill, and having already broached the conversation of the custom of the sea, what was to happen to the survivors came very clear. They soon held the man down and stuck a penknife into his throat. Killing him, the men stripped him of organs and meat before tossing his now mutilated body overboard, where they were able to sustain themselves off his body for 24 days lost at sea, until a German boat heading for Hamburg spotted and rescued the men. Nathari Kond. This entry is in reference to 2006 Noida serial murders happening near the Nathari village. Body parts and children's clothing were found in a septic tank in front of Moninder Singh Pandar's home, where he and his worker, Surinder Kohli, were arrested for the string of killings. It was suspected at least 19 women and children had been raped, killed, and dismembered. The first thought of motive was participating in the large illegal organ trade, along with the fact that a doctor in the same neighborhood at the time had been accused of a similar crime just a few years before. This quickly became a giant news story, and the media had reported that one of the accused had allegedly confessed to eating the livers and body parts of the victims. The issue with this is the fact that they had yet to even begin the proper investigation and interrogation of the suspects. And ultimately, this appeared to have been a fabricated matter by the media to cause further shock in the story surrounding the murders. Ultimately, in 2023, both men were acquitted of all charges due to lack of evidence against them, but there's been no other suspects in the case, and it's widely believed they were in fact the perpetrators. Alexander Pierce. Alexander was an Irish criminal who was sent to Australia to serve 7 years on theft charges. On September 20th of 1822, Alexander and 7 other convicts would escape, and after 15 days of being on the run, with no resources, they drew straws on who would be killed for food. So the leader of the group, Robert Greenhill, took an axe, killing the man. After this, 3 others ran from the group, most likely scared that they would be next. This left 4 men in total: Greenhill, Travers, Mather, and Alexander Pierce. Eventually, Travers was bit by a snake, and after carrying the man for 5 days, it was clear it was no use. It was doing nothing but weighing the other men down. Allegedly, Pierce grabbed the axe and killed Greenhill and ate him. He later came across a settled area where he began eating a lamb, but when confronted by the shepherd, it was revealed to be an old friend of his. He then ended up in, I'm not kidding you, a sheep-stealing criminal ring. He was ultimately caught and sentenced to death. Alexander Pierce was hanged on July 19th of 1824. Anthony Morley. Anthony is an English model and the first ever Mr. Gay UK, as well as a convicted murderer and cannibal. In 1996, he was a contestant on a TV show called God's Gift. It's believed that this is where he met his victim and lover, Damien Oldfield, a magazine executive. Damon was in the audience that day of the filming due to the fact that he was a contestant on a different episode of the same program, and it was 12 years later that Anthony would be arrested for killing Damon. It's believed that after inviting him to his apartment, Anthony killed him, cut off a portion of his leg, and began to cook it. After this, he went to a kebab restaurant around 2:30 in the morning, covered in blood, telling someone to call the police. He was promptly arrested and is now serving a life sentence for the murder. Ed Kemper. Often referred to as the co-ed killer, Ed killed 8 women in the short span of 1972 to 1973, particularly 6 young female hitchhikers, and at the end, his mother and her friend. Ed, similar to Jeffrey Dahmer, thought that killing these women would keep them with him forever, and he was creating, everlasting, women with him. I don't know, I hate it. It's just, I hate Ed Kemper. He creeps me out so much. Ed Kemper creeps me out so much. And if you once again are like, Darby, are you going to say he wasn't actually a cannibal like the other 2? This one actually has a bit of leg to stand on, due to the fact that Kemper himself at one point during a psychology, what the fuck do you call that? A therapy appointment? A psychologist appointment? I don't know. A psychologist-induced truth serum, so this isn't really true, induced truth serum to Ed Kemper, and during this, he admitted to, or at least was led into, or at least at the bare minimum, said he did in fact cannibalize parts of his victim. Ed did later retract this statement and say he never cannibalized anyone, and with the extreme lengths of necromutilomania, the postmortem necrophiling, mutilation, and just, the things he did to these women's bodies and his own mother's bodies, so violently disgusting that I think if there were signs of cannibalism, they would have caught on to them. There were no signs of cannibalism, and this is the one and only time he ever mentioned it, and again, he backtracked it and he was given truth serum. Also, to just make you feel gross, Ed Kemper's still alive, so. Zhu Kan. Zhu was a rebel leader during the Chinese Sui dynasty. He was well known for his excessive cruelty and partaking of cannibalism. It was said at one point that Zhu had around 200,000 men under his rule capturing cities. Particularly that when they arrived, his men and him would take the entire food storage, even burning the leftover food they didn't consume from cities, leading to mass spreads of starvation. And with the rebel army moving around, destroying food supplies in their wake, there became an extreme lack of food for themselves. This led to Zhu encouraging them to begin eating women and children, saying, "Human flesh is the most delicious flesh. As long as there are people around, we need not worry about hunger." He also ordered the cities under his control to deliver old people and children to his camps to be eaten by the soldiers. Eventually, Zhu was sentenced to death after the disengagement period of the dynasty, and with how much despise was held at his cruelty, after his death, rocks were thrown at his body in such great numbers that they soon piled up like a tomb. The Boone Island Cannibals of Maine. The Nottingham Galley was part of a convoy of merchant boats that set sail from London on September 10th of 1710. The Nottingham eventually became separated, and there's two very different stories on how this happened. The captain himself claims that he was trying to evade privateers, whereas the crew members claim that the captain was trying to force the boat to privateers to get an insurance claim on the boat. It's of note that the captain was a vicious one, even beating crew members to the point of physical impairment and cutting rations extremely small. Eventually, on December 11th, the boat would crash against the Boone Island. The men were able to get to land and create makeshift tents out of the now destroyed ship and gather what few food resources floated around. On just day 2, the ship's cook would die, but they were still able to live off of the few resources they had and the animals they were able to kill that they came across. Land was 6 miles away, and after a few failed attempts at making ships or getting passing boats' attentions, it became clear the men were trapped. It was winter, and the weather was getting so horrible that men began freezing to death, the first being the ship's carpenter, who would be the first man cannibalized. The captain, being a trained butcher, cut off his hands and feet before stripping the man's meat into thin shreds to feed the surviving crew members. Eventually, a man, John Stover, came across the men, only at this time 7 and the captain remaining alive. But as he only arrived in a canoe and the weather was worsening for wear, he had to return with more resources to rescue them. He created a fire for the men and trekked back off, unable to return for another 3 days. Eventually, on January 4th of 1711, the final 8 men would be rescued. Andre Thomas. Andre had an extreme history of mental health issues, including auditory hallucinations by the age of 10. And in the 9th grade, he impregnated his girlfriend Laura, who would end up marrying at the age of 18 in 1999. After a tumultuous time for the couple between having to find places to live and Andre financially supporting the two, they would end up splitting. Laura would end up meeting a new man and having a child with him in 2003. After this split, it seems Andre's mental health issues escalated, including a fixation on the apocalypse, in particular, the Book of Revelations. He was having trouble keeping jobs and a roof over his head, and eventually got into a physical altercation with his brother that he may have stabbed during the fight, but no charges or indictment were ever put against him on this. All of these things led to Laura limiting his visitation with his son. Seemingly, this caused Andre to believe she was a Jezebel, and their son was the Antichrist. In March of 2004, he went to a mental health clinic about his suicidal thoughts, and the staff redirected him to go to the ER. Andre never did. 3 weeks later, Andre stabbed himself in the chest, saying he was trying to cross over to heaven. The wound itself was a non-life-threatening one, so they were going to move him into a psychiatric facility. While they were making these preparations, Andre got up and left the hospital. The physician then contacted the police, informing them he may be a danger to himself or others. The police never followed up or contacted Andre. Just 2 days later, he went to Laura's apartment, breaking her door in while her boyfriend was at work, fatally stabbing her, their 4-year-old son, as well as Laura's 1-year-old daughter, and proceeded to cut open all their chests, removing the hearts from both children. After this, Andre stabbed himself 3 times in the chest, but once he realized he once again failed at his self-ending, he placed the organs in his pockets and went home to leave a troubling voicemail to Laura's parents. He then turned himself into the police, saying he thought God wanted him to kill Laura and the children. 5 days later, Andre would remove his own eyeball and ingest it. He was soon diagnosed as schizophrenic. Andre was initially deemed unfit for trial due to insanity, but later this was appealed that he was under drug-induced psychosis due to him having been partaking in cough syrup recreationally. He was placed against an all-white jury in Texas, with one of them even saying in relation to Andre and Laura being in an interracial relationship, quote, "I don't believe God intended for this. We should stay with our bloodline," unquote. Andre, undeniably, being afflicted with schizophrenia, but being failed by the legal system, just as he had been failed multiple times by other people trying to stop what inevitably happened, was convicted of capital murder and given a death sentence. While incarcerated on death row, he removed his other eye and once again ingested it, saying it would stop the government from reading his thoughts. His execution date is still postponed, and he is still sitting on death row. Ryoye Maro. The Yororei Maro was a small Japanese fishing boat that engine failed in December of 1926, leaving the 12 crew members stranded and to starve to death. The boat was found in October of 1927, with 2 bodies intact and the bones of 7 to 8 members still aboard, showing signs of cannibalism. It's unknown exactly what took place on the boat, but one thing's for sure. It was once again an instance of the custom of the sea. A Buddhist ceremony was held for all 12 men. Then they were cremated and the boat was burned. Tariyar. You may or may not have heard of the man who ate everything before, but if not, Tarriere was a Frenchman who had an insatiable appetite, to the point he was kicked out of his home as a teenager for how much food he ate. And when in the army, they had to quadruple his rations, but he was still hungry, eating any and all scraps around. Before this, he was part of a traveling sideshow, as the man that ate everything. It was said his jaw was so deformed he could swing it open and fit an entire basket of apples in it, even his mouth alone fitting a dozen apples in his cheeks. He would also swallow inanimate objects like corks or rocks, and even eating live animals completely whole to the crowd's disgust. As well, he was so smelly from his diet that the official medical records said, quote, "He often stank to such a degree that he could not be endured within the distance of 20 paces, unquote. Eventually, when it was clear he was no use to the French military after failed espionage missions, he ended up in a hospital, begging a doctor to try to cure him of his condition, but it was no success. At one point, he was caught drinking the blood of patients, and even parts of the bodies of corpses in the morgue. This had one final escalation. When a 14-month-old baby went missing, fingers were pointed to Tarriere, and he was ran off from the hospital. He eventually died of tuberculosis in 1798, and his autopsy showed extreme abnormalities, especially the fact that his stomach filled almost the entire abdominal cavity. It showed that his need to consume was one of a biological nature and not a mental affliction. It has never been confirmed if he did in fact eat the baby at the hospital, but it is heavily, heavily suspected. Cannibal of Siberia. This is about Alexander or Sasha. I can't even come close to pronouncing this properly. I'm sorry. I can't say it, but he's a bad man, so do we care? He was a serial murderer and cannibal of mainly children. Particularly from this entry on Murderipedia, it says, he was born in the Siberian town of, Novokuznetsk. That sounded good, right? 1969, and was raised in an abusive home with a violent father who tortured the entire family. As an adult, he murdered his girlfriend and was committed to a psychiatric institution, from which he was later released. He subsequently shared a flat with his mother and with his dog. In 1996, a pipe breakage forced the neighbors to call a plumber. The problem was determined to be in their apartment. The plumber had the door opened by force, since no one was answering. When authorities entered the flat, they saw blood-covered walls. In the kitchen, there were bowls and pieces of human bodies. In the bathtub, they found a mutilated, headless body. Olga Glatseva was found, also mutilated but still alive on the sofa. She was taken to the hospital where she was able to tell the public prosecutor about what had happened. She unfortunately would die 17 hours later. Sasha's mother had lured 3 girls into a flat, where he then raped and beat them. He killed one of the girls and forced the other 2 to cut her into pieces in the bathtub. The mother cooked her body parts for dinner. The second girl was killed by Sasha's dog. He himself escaped over the balcony when he heard someone opening the door. He was later captured while attempting to rape another woman in her own apartment. The police found a diary which detailed the murders of 19 girls in total. He's generally suspected to have been responsible for over a dozen deaths, but Russian authorities lacked the funds to successfully investigate those cases. He was ultimately declared guilty in all 19 cases and sentenced to death. His mother denied any involvement, was convicted as an accomplice, and sentenced to life in prison. Jose Luis Calva Zepeda, sometimes referred to as the Mexico City cannibal, Jose had a very long history of being abusive in his relationships, and after his ex-girlfriend Alejandra didn't go into work in October of 2007, her mother would point the police in the direction of Jose because of his controlling behavior towards Alejandra when they were together. The police arrived to Jose's apartment. They were met with a house of horrors. He answered the door while eating a bowl full of meat. This then turned out to be the flesh from Alejandra's body. He attempted to jump out the window to avoid capture, but failed to do so. And when investigating the apartment, they found the mutilated body of Alejandra hidden in a closet, missing parts of her body. They then discovered chunks of her flesh found in the fridge, a frying pan on the stove, and even bones with evidence of frying inside a cereal box. As well as an extremely bizarre image Jose had edited of himself to appear as the character Hannibal Lecter from the film Silence of the Lambs, as well as an unfinished poem called Cannibal Instincts describing what he had done to Alejandra. He was sentenced to serve 84 years, but would take his own life in a cell just 2 months after his arrest. Vampire of Sacramento. Richard Chase was a paranoid schizophrenic man who went on a serial killing rampage. His entire fixation surrounded blood, and that's due in part to why he was referred to as a vampire. But Richard had a lot of paranoid delusions, including the fact he believed his skull split and that the plates were moving, so he shaved his head to look at it, and he would kill small animals, and eventually he injected the blood of a rabbit into himself, which, you can guess, made him real sick. So he ended up having to go to the hospital, and then they're like, you did what? So he went to a mental health facility where they literally nicknamed him Dracula because of his blood obsession and still trying to kill small animals. And somehow they thought they rehabilitated Richard Chase and sent him back home to his mom. I'm going to tell you right now, Richard Chase was not rehabilitated in any sense of the word. Eventually, Richard believed that his mother was poisoning him, so he left and moved in with a bunch of boys. And during this in-between time of the serial killing and leaving his mother, the police found Richard Chase naked, covered in blood, and with organs in a bucket. And once identifying the blood and organ to belonging to a cow, they just let Richard go, which, this is now the second time we're saying a system failed stopping Richard Chase at helping him and saving people. And beyond his blood obsession, Richard had this weird belief that he said in his interrogation that he thought if the door was open to a home, he was allowed to come in. He was invited in. And this would unfortunately be the case of his second victim, a pregnant woman, Teresa Wallen. Richard would kill Teresa Wallen, a pregnant woman who was inside her own home, which had the front door unlocked. Richard, while during his interrogation, expressed part of his paranoid schizophrenic thoughts was that if a door was unlocked, he saw it as an invitation to come in. So him checking Teresa's door and finding it unlocked thought he was welcome to come in. This also helped fuel the soon nickname of Vampire, as he only went in if he was invited. He shot her with the same gun he had previously used and then proceeded to mutilate her body, as well as drinking a cup of her blood, as this was once again his biggest fixture and delusion. He believed he needed blood to survive and that it gave him power. Even when they went to Richard's house to do the investigation after he was arrested, they found a blender just covered in blood. 4 days later, Richard would kill 4 people: Evelyn Meroth, her 6-year-old Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and her friend Dan Meredith. Richard shot Dan in the hallway. He then killed Evelyn and her son in her bedroom. Richard proceeded to cannibalize some of Evelyn's organs and rape her post-mortem. It wouldn't be until months later they would find David, the 22-month-old, decapitated behind a church. The reason we know Richard Chase was the culprit was because during this entire massacre, a neighbor ended up knocking on the door, spooking Richard into taking the body of the 22-year-old, the keys from Dan, and running off, leaving behind bloody footprints that would eventually lead them to him. When the police searched Richard Chase's house, they once again found blood everywhere, over his cutlery and kitchen tools, as well as human brains within his fridge. Richard was ultimately sentenced to death by gas, but stored away his anti-anxiety pills while incarcerated and took a lethal dose, ending his own life. Richard Chase is a prime example of the failings of the psychiatric institutions and the police department. Michael Woodmansey. When Michael was 16 years old, he killed 5-year-old Jason Foreman in 1975 in Rhode Island. He didn't confess to this crime until almost 8 years later when being questioned for attempting to strangle a child. When searching his room, they found Jason's skull and various other bones on top of a dresser, as well as a journal Michael kept that he said was fiction but seemingly contained details of the murder of the young boy and believed to describe acts of cannibalism onto the boy's body. But the journal was destroyed after Michael's sentencing, where he pled guilty, leading to the cannibalism charges never becoming a part of the official case, but it's widely believed to be a matter of fact of what happened to Jason post-mortem. Karl Denk. Karl was a German serial killer and cannibal. He began murdering homeless people and poor travelers from 1903 to 1924. His first known victim was Ida Lorner in 1903. Then 6 years later, he would kill Emma Sander, which an innocent man was found guilty of her death and wasn't released until Karl's arrest in 1926. His last known victim was Rokas Paulik. Karl was caught when he attempted to kill a man with an axe in his home, who narrowly escaped, leaving with large gashes on his head, screaming that a madman was trying to kill him. Once Karl was put in a holding cell, he took his life just hours later. The reason we have knowledge of his crimes is mainly due to the fact that he kept a ledger of them, including his excessive acts of cannibalism. and a victim list containing as many as 31 names, with some people even estimating that he killed and ate more than that, especially with the sheer amount of human remains and meat found within his home. Once searched, they found at least 7 heads, 65 feet in metacarpal bones, and several items made out of tanned human skin, including shoelaces, belts, and braces. Carl is often referred to as the forgotten cannibal because he's not mentioned much, if ever, but he is by far one of the most prolific cannibals that there has been. It's also believed he may have been selling human flesh as pork to unsuspecting people in several towns. Aztec cannibalism. Now, the Hollywood idea of constant virgin sacrifices of eating still beating hearts is just that, Hollywood. But there has been archaeological evidence of ceremonial cannibalism performed by the Aztecs. This would coincide with important dates or environmental events like droughts. Outside of this, during the 15th and 16th century, they would at times ritualistically kill war captives and create displays of their skull, with the vast majority of these skulls found in ritual sites belonging to outsiders from DNA tests. This would be an extremely effective tactic of intimidation, and it's believed at times that they would cannibalize the bodies after the sacrifice was made, usually eaten by noblemen or affluent members of the community. Corpse medicine. As I've mentioned before, medical cannibalism started following the ideology of like cures like. So if you have a bad eye, you should eat something involving eye. As mentioned earlier, the king's drops involving powdered skull would regularly be the remedy for head issues. With the now very real existence of blood transfusions and organ transplants, you can see the building rudimentary idea they had, that was oddly not as far off as it would seem. And of course, the very documented practice of mummy consumption, that actually all falls down to an improper translation of Arabic medical texts that really meant Dead Sea settlement, but led to the entire craze of mummy trafficking and consumption by ancient Victorians. It's another point of extremely interesting hypocrisy humans have always held. At this time, Victorians were eating the bone dust and organs of others, while telling stories of savage cannibal tribes in other continents, when in all reality, they were the savage cannibals. They just found a way to sell and button it up as a digestible practice. Literally. Liver eating Johnson. I actually omitted him from my American cannibalism video because there's kind of more evidence pointing to it all being baloney than it being true, but you know, we're just having some fun, so here is the tale of Liver Eating Johnson. With that, there's various stories about who he was and what he did, but the most common is that in 1847, his wife, a member of the Flathead tribe, was killed by a Crow man and other hunters, so he went on to enact his revenge against them, allegedly killing, scalping, and eating the livers of over 300 Crow tribesmen. And after 25 years of this grudge, he eventually made peace with the Crows and considered them brothers. Armin Mize. Armin. I feel like I can't go 3 videos without mentioning Armin. So, you know, let's just do it. Armin had an extreme interest in cannibalism since he was a young boy, citing the tales of Hansel and Gretel, as well as his imaginary friend he based off of the boy of Flipper, which he eventually fantasized eating. On top of all this, he was taught butcherment and gutting animals at an extremely young age, which no doubt influenced his deviant desires. As an adult, he lived with his mother, who eventually passed away, and he had a very odd, almost Ed Gein-esque relationship with his mother, so the passing of her did nothing but kind of push him to just really go for it. He as well was extremely lonely. If you can see, we're seeing a lot of common themes today with men in cannibalism. But Armin, going after his interest, was posting in a lot of various cannibal forums, as well as nullification and eunuch forums, which, you know, a little more on that later. Including Cannibal Cafe, which we will be discussing later, a lot more in depth, but Armin did not meet anyone or have any victims from the Cannibal Cafe. I mention this because it is very commonly misreferred to as the Cannibal Cafe murder, or that Armin met his victim on Cannibal Cafe, which it's not true at all. Armin grew frustrated in role-playing forums like these because that's exactly what they were, role-playing, and Armin had no interest in pretending he wanted to eat human flesh. He wanted to. This was not a game to him. He wanted to have someone become a part of him, never leaving. A constant thought within cannibalism. He placed around 60 ads on various sites looking for a willing victim. This was kind of the biggest thing for Armin, was he wanted someone willing and frankly into it. He did not just want to kill someone to do it. Like, this was an entire psychological situation for him, and even frankly a relationship. Ultimately, he would find someone that became a willing participant. This was Bernd, whose wants didn't exactly line up with Armin. He was much more into the castration, killing, pain kind of thing. And, relationships are all about compromise. And him and Armin did get to that compromise, but not before the first time they meted. Byrne actually left because he thought there's just no way Armin could really do what he wanted done. But he changed his mind, turned back around, and they went back to Armin's house. And, they did a lot. They first ended up cutting off Byrne's member. Once both realizing it wasn't good for consumption raw, Armin tried cooking it. I say try because Armin burnt it so poorly they could not eat it, and he ended up feeding the pieces to his dog. The entire mutilation and murder was all filmed and shown in part during court, but has never reached the public. I mention this video because Armin believed that Byrne died of blood loss at some point during the night from the member mutilation. But later, looking at the video, Armin says he noticed he may have still been breathing when he began dismembering his body. Armin ate off of the butchered corpse of Byrne for 10 months until his eventual arrest, keeping the body parts under a bunch of frozen pizzas in his freezer. Armin is still incarcerated, but he regularly tries, when the time is up for him, to be early released. He was denied this year in 2025, but I believe they've stated they're looking hopeful for Armin's release in 2026. Placentophagy is the act of postpartum placenta consumption. The placenta can be consumed in various means, raw or prepared, from cooking, dehydrating, steeping in fluid, typically under the guise of medicinal properties of consumption, with either auto-cannibalism or eating the placenta of someone else, referred to as non-maternal placentophagy. Non-maternal placenta eating has been a very common practice in China, still to this day, with texts dating as far back as the 16th century in reference to non-maternal placenta digestion. As almost all historical placenta consumption relates to being eaten by the non-maternal figure, usually the family. As well, in India, there has been documented belief that women with fertility issues would be encouraged to eat the placenta of others to try to rid them of whatever was causing the issue. Once again, a form of corpse medicine. Really, the entire maternal consumption of one's own placenta is a much more modern phenomenon, mostly being pointed as starting in the US around the 1970s, usually from the idea that it has beneficial properties to consuming it. Mainly being the iron loss women experience from pregnancy can be regained from eating it, and there's been a few tests hypothesizing that most postpartum depression can be related to the iron loss women experience. But there has not been enough studies providing any evidence, if positive at all, of the effects of consuming placenta. If anything, we have more evidence that it truly doesn't do anything positive or negative. Vorophilia. All my OG followers know this is a real touchy one for me. Shout out to all the pre-incident watchers. This is the attraction to being consumed whole by commonly another individual. Due to the platform we are on, I cannot discuss further. Continuation War. This takes us to a photo of a Finnish soldier showing the skinned flesh of Soviet soldiers that were made during the Continuation War in 1942. The photo in particular was captioned as, "An enemy recon patrol that was cut out of food supplies had butchered a few members of their own patrol group and had eaten most of them." Rick Gibson. Rick is an artist that is best known for his performance art pieces, and in July of 1988, he ate human flesh. More specifically, he ate a canapé of donated human tonsils, and this wouldn't be his only act of cannibalism. A year later, he ate a slice of a human testicle, and this wouldn't be the only time for that either. About 2 months later, he went to the Pitt International Galleries of Vancouver and attempted to eat another slice, but the police confiscated the slice from him. And if you think this would be the last of the slice, you would be wrong. The police attempted to charge him with publicly exhibiting a disgusting object, as cannibalism had no major laws against it at the time. But this charge was dropped, and 2 months later, he finally ate that piece of human testicle on the steps of the Vancouver courthouse. Gregory Hale. Gregory is a loser who idolized a loser. More specifically, he idolized Richard Ramirez, often referred to as the Night Stalker, a serial killer, rapist, pedophile that killed people in the 80s in California. Gregory killed and cannibalized Marie Hyder, a mother of 6, after offering her a ride home from the store to try to follow in Richard's footsteps, even saying he read Richard's manifesto and was going to carry out a satanic ritual to a T. He proceeded to ask his neighbors to help dispose of her body, telling them intimate details of the crime. The police report states, "Subject beheaded her and cut off her hands, placing her head and hands in a plastic bucket. He cut off her feet and other body parts, placing them in another bucket, and buried the victim's torso in a burnt pile at the residence." Just this year, Gregory pled guilty to first-degree murder and will be serving a life sentence without any possibility of parole. If you're interested in this case further, Explore With Us has an entire video about it. Fu Deng. Fu Deng was an emperor of the former Qin dynasty who led large battles against Yao Cheng, which the timing of these battles lined up unfortunately with droughts and famines, leading to the long-standing practice of eating the rivals, a form of exo-cannibalism. This occurred so often that Fu even called killed enemies cooked food, telling his soldiers, "Fight in the morning and you will have meat to eat in the evening. Why worry about hunger?" And this was absolutely no secret practice the army was partaking in. Frankly, they liked everyone knowing. It was an extremely effective fear tactic that even resulted in Yao contacting his brother for help in battle, saying, "If you do not come, we are going to be eaten off by Fu Deng." Luxborough Galley. This was an English ship that in 1727 exploded and sank in the Atlantic Ocean. The boat was not only a cargo shipment, but also one of transporting African slaves, which during the start of their journey, 600 of the enslaved had died from smallpox, which was only 1/3 of how many people they were keeping chained and enslaved on the boat. The boat set sail from England in October of 1725, and on June 25th of 1727, the boat caught fire from rum and sugar it was carrying being set ablaze by a dropped torch. Unable to launch the longboat, the smaller emergency boat was filled beyond capacity, with 22 men and boys, leaving at least 16 crew members behind on the burning boat. With no food and no water, you can be inclined towards what happens next. The crew were drifting in the ocean for 2 weeks, reduced to just 12 survivors until they were rescued by a group of fishermen. The captain died the very next day, and ultimately only 5 men would survive the entire ordeal back to land. A publication of one of the survivor stories is as follows. The sensation of hunger was not so urgent, but we all saw the necessity of recruiting our bodies with some more substantial nourishment. And it was at this time we found ourselves impelled to adopt the horrible expedient of eating part of the bodies of our dead companions and drinking their blood. Mengshan County. This entry is more specifically about the Guangzhou massacre that occurred in Mengshan County. The massacre occurred in 1968. Initially reported on by Zheng Ye after doing intense research in the 1980s, he suggested that at least 137 people, if not hundreds more, were cannibalized by the men, and that thousands partook in eating their flesh. He was able to smuggle copies of this report to the US, as well as his documentation showed a variety of cannibalism, seemingly none for survival and purely for pleasure or power. Eating human flesh as a snack, slicing them into large pieces of cooked meat for parties, barbecuing organs whole, and so on. Many thought this to be a bit dramatic or even false propaganda, but in 2016 and 2017, official archive records would be published revealing an actually more horrific truth than what had Zhang documented. What he reported on was really just a fraction of the cannibalism that had taken place. The archive showed that at least 302 people were killed and eaten, and tens of thousands of others partook in the cannibalization of their bodies. Independent researchers counted a total of 421 people who were eaten. This would happen in over 2/3 of the entire country. This is an extremely rare documentation of mass non-survival cannibalism. A professor at the University of British Columbia and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology said, "This was not cannibalism because of economic difficulties like during famine. It was not caused by economic reasons. It was caused by political events, political hatred, political ideologies, political rituals." Gladiator blood. The consumption of fresh human blood goes back to ancient Rome, where many believed that the blood from a wounded gladiator could cure epilepsy. As well, it was a fairly common practice to consume the blood of another gladiator if you won in battle, as a form of power gaining, consuming their strength or life force from consuming the blood of the man you beat in battle. Mao Sugiyame. Mao is a bit of a twofer for us on the channel, because not only is there cannibalization, but as well there's nullification. Mao Sugiyame is a performance artist in Japan who decided to go under nullification surgery, which nullification surgery is the removal of all gendered items downstairs. Now, as a performance artist and someone who likes to rebel against gender normatives and things of that nature, Mao thought, what better than doing something with the removed member? And not just doing something. He decided to bid off tickets on Twitter, of all places, to dinner where you would get to eat a chunk of his member. And of course, this was a performance piece, so it was a very large event. Mao dressed for the occasion, cooked it right there for everybody, and on the record, it is said he did an awful job cooking it, and it was disgusting to the point, like, a really big cooking magazine commented on it and was like, "You're such an idiot, you should have sous vide it." Like, I'm so serious, it was that insane of an occurrence. As well, there were a bunch of people in attendance, and I think they were fed weird exotic meats like alligator and stuff, but Mao is still happy with his choice of nullification and the performance of cutting up, serving, and cooking it. So that's awesome. If you want to hear more about nullification and eunuchs, watch my video about the eunuch maker. Nothing's settling in how more messed up I am than the amount of plugins I can do for videos that are already existing on this channel. Zhang Yun was a military official during the Tang Dynasty in China. His cannibalistic nature occurred during the Battle of Suyang. Zhang and his men ended up on the bottom during this battle. He was being advised that they should abandon their land and flee, but he decided they needed to keep defending the city. And with how weak they were from lack of resources, they wouldn't have been able to flee far at all. As they ran further out, they began killing and eating. As they further ran out of resources, they began killing and eating their horses, followed by any birds or rats they came across. And eventually, Zhang killed his concubine to feed his soldiers. But this wouldn't end here. This was followed with the killing and eating of any servants, then women in the city, and finally non-able-bodied men. Eventually, only 400 people remained in total within the city, including all of the soldiers. Eventually, the Yuan did enter the city and took control. Homo antecessor. Latin for pioneer man, the Homo antecessor was a species of archaic humans that we have quite substantial evidence of them participating in cannibalism. There's been at least 80 remains of adolescents and children specimens that show clear signs of butcherment and consumption. In the Grandolina exhibit, there are no fully complete skulls. This is seemingly from the means they had for removing flesh for consumption, done by the ancestor. Most of the smashing of the skulls is believed so they could access the brain for consumption of it, as well as the evidence of muscle detachment from the skull to the rest of the body, which is seen throughout the rib bones, most likely from disembowelments. In total, it appears they removed the meaty sections of the body and discarded the rest. It's unclear if this was a practice of endo or exocannibalism, and it's debated amongst historians of why these specific adolescents and children were eaten. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The U.S. State Department has said that the Jalisco Cartel is considered to be the most violent drug trafficking organization currently operating in Mexico, with the highest cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine trafficking capacity. They have their own terrorist schools where they train new recruits, and this is where the cannibalism aspects take place for them. It's believed to have started around 2015 and is mostly associated with the practice of eating raw human hearts out the chest of enemies, which at one point was filmed and spread around greatly online. And many cartel videos revolving the act of cutting the heart out of an individual while they're alive and eating it is typically placed onto this cartel's practice. In these terror schools, they're trained on using weapons and combat fighting. Within a few months of being there, during their training, they are forced into their first initiation of eating human flesh. They're taught on how to properly sever toes and fingers for interrogation means. They are then later made to eat the cut off parts as a part of their testing to then move on further, usually leading to consuming the at times still beating heart of their enemy. As mentioned, there's been various videos uploaded by their practices of cannibalism, and seemingly it's one that isn't going anywhere. Alberto Sanchez Gomez. In 2019, Alberto strangled his 68-year-old mother following an argument in their shared apartment in Madrid, which after he used a carpenter's saw and 2 kitchen knives to cut his mother's body up into 1,000 pieces, some of which were found in Tupperware containers inside their residence. Over 2 weeks, he ate pieces of his own mother, as well as feeding some of these pieces to his dog. He attempted a plea of being in an episode of psychological affliction once arrested, but this did not hold up in court, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Joseph Oberhansley. In 2014, in Indiana, Joseph entered his ex-girlfriend's apartment, Tammy Jo Blanton, and raped, murdered, and cannibalized her. In the morning of September 11th, Joseph was found by the police inside Tammy's home with her dismembered body in her bathtub. As well in the kitchen, there was a skillet, tongs, and a plate covered in blood, with what appeared to be bones on top of it. During the interview he gave that day to authorities, he admitted to killing Tammy, but would later attempt to retract this, saying that 2 men entered the home, knocked him out, and that they killed and cannibalized Tammy. He tried to use this defense in court to absolutely no avail. He never spoke on explicitly how, when, or if he did in fact cannibalize Tammy at all, and Joseph is currently serving a life sentence for killing her. Makonyo translates to the corrupt one or corruption in the local Zulu language. He was a traditional healer that turned himself into the local police, saying he was tired of eating people. He wasn't taken seriously until he came back with a bloodied hand and foot, leading to them immediately arresting him. He then took them to his home he was renting, which was littered with human remains, including 8 ears in a cooking pot. It's believed him and 5 other men that were arrested in conjunction were running a sort of cannibalism ring under the guise of there being magical properties to be obtained by eating human flesh, and that they could be the reason for missing persons in the area, including the found decapitated body of a 25-year-old mother in the area. This is not a true practice of traditional healing, with a well-known honest one, Miss Masko, saying, "Ritual killings and the use of human tissue are not a part of traditional healing. This angers us as traditional healers because we have to constantly defend our honest work." Granny Ripper. Tamara, better known as the Granny Ripper, was arrested at the age of 68 for a suspected serial killing of at least 11 individuals, as well as the suspected cannibalism of some of them. She gained a lot of notoriety due to the fact that there was CCTV footage of her carrying out her final victim. And I recall seeing this in the news, and I'm sure you probably do too, because it was kind of big when it happened. I think it's always a lot bigger in the news when serial killings done by older individuals. After her husband's disappearance in 2000, she began renting a room out in her apartment. And in 2003, she would kill her first victim, her tenant, Sergi, during an argument, and then she dismembered and dumped his body on the streets. Her final victim was a mutual friend, 79-year-old Valentina, who was living with her while her apartment was being renovated. Eventually, Tamara asked her to move out, and Valentina simply said no. So she did what she, I guess, learned, and she put sleeping pills into a salad, fed it to Tamara, who, once lethargic enough, began dismembering her body when she was still alive. She proceeded to yank a shower curtain down, wrap the body in, carry it out, and dump it. Quickly, they were able to trace this back to Tamara, and this is where they found a diary containing the confessions of, I believe, at least 11 murders. As well, it is suspected that this also contained claims of cannibalism, particularly about the lungs, and all the victims traced to her were in fact missing organs, and particularly the lungs. Now, most of this diary is not available to the public, and from what I can find, most records of stuff as well, so it's a little ambiguous about the cannibalism. I know the Russian officials said it is not excluded, which I feel like is how Russian people say yeah, like, it's not a no. Like, I don't know. Maybe I have a wrong perception of Russia, but it seems like a lot of the stuff just hasn't come over into English news, the explicit details of court stuff. So if you know that, feel free to comment them down below. I would love to read them. We've reached tier 5. We are halfway. I just hit the mic. We are halfway through the Cannibalism Iceberg. So how we feeling, team? I'm feeling a little tired, not gonna lie to you guys. Not gonna lie. But, you know, if there's one thing we must do, it is persist. Moula Gursi is a cave site below the now modern Rhone River in south of France that 100,000 years ago was occupied by Neanderthals. With excavations happening on the site since 1991, it has yielded proof of Neanderthal cannibalism. With 6 remains found by researchers showing clear signs of being eaten, this is believed to be survival cannibalism because of the drastic climate changes occurring in the area, with many being forced to move and the ones that did stay losing resources from the animals also migrating, as well as the new environment being so foreign to them. But the marks and cuts found on the bones within the cave match what was found on animal bones. Some historians argue on if it was more complicated rituals happening past the survival acts, but it is still to this day being studied. Zizamis. The Zizamis, which I apologize for the pronunciation as it stems from a dead language, clarification is hard, were an indigenous people from southeast Mexico. They're most noted for their resistance to the Spanish at the colonization of their people and land, as well as the practice of cannibalism. While the Spanish colonizers documented extensive practice of cannibalism by the indigenous people, especially their consumption of killed enemies, it was fairly disputed, as previously mentioned, similar to the Aztec cannibalism, and a means of intimidation against enemies. But in 2011, Jose Luis Punzo argued that newly discovered bones from the area the indigenous people lived in constituted proof of the practice, citing evidence of boiling and defleshing. The Wari. The Wari are a sect of indigenous people of Brazil who at one point practiced mortuary cannibalism. This was done as an act of respect, grief, and eternal love to their dead individual. The immediate family would embrace the person post-mortem and leave their body waiting for all the family to arrive for the funeral before performing any steps of preparation. This typically would lead to multiple days of decomposition setting in. The eating of the flesh was a form of release for the bereaved. It meant that the soul of the deceased would continue living on in the relatives instead of being left abandoned to wander the forest. The practice ended around the 1960s. Anthropophage, or anthropophagy, anthropophagy? I think that's right. I'm going off the movie title to get this word. But this is in reference to a fictional creatures or race made up by the playwright William Shakespeare. He referenced them a few times within plays. In particular, in Othello, he said, "And of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagus, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders." Which just actually led to confusion on the visual depictions of these creatures due to the fact that the beginning half, he was talking about the anthropophagy, and then he was talking about a different creature on the second half, Belmies. Guys, I'm talking so much in this video. Please forgive my mispronunciation. But these were actually, I've seen these a lot actually in stuff, usually I see them called headless men, but they don't have heads, their faces are on their torsos, and this is actually how some people depicted these creatures for a while. With that, William Shakespeare, actually a nightmare maker, some of the most horrifying literary works I frankly have ever read are from William Shakespeare, from like cannibalism, killing babies for payback, necrophiling, like, he is such a dark, crazy man. He was, like, writing Cannibal Corpse's songs. And, if you guys want a video about the horrors of Shakespeare, please comment down below, because I frankly would love to make that video, but, you know, it's a little niche. Charles Domry. Charles was known for his insatiable appetite, and this will start sounding a bit familiar to our early entry of Terrier. Charles, a Parisian man, joined the military at 13, but quickly found himself beyond starving on the small rations from the food shortage they were experiencing. And even after the army doubling his portions, he would be tempted over to joining the enemy, the French, for increased food rations. On top of his new food, he allegedly ate 5 pounds of grass a day, and he even began consuming live cats. It's been quoted that he ate as many as 174 cats in a singular year. But what leads us to discussing him is that once, while serving for the French military on a battleship, one of the crewmen had their leg blasted off by a cannon, to which Charles dove for it, attempting to eat it, until he was wrestled away by his fellow soldiers. The British took him and the others as prisoner of war, where they quickly learned of Charles' appetite while he was incarcerated. It said they gave him the rations of 100 men, just for him to still be hungry, leading to the interest of his condition creating him the subject of experiment. Particularly once, they woke him up at 4 a.m., giving him 4 pounds of cow udder to eat, followed by 5 pounds of raw beef and 1 dozen candles. He ate it all, and seemingly was unaffected by the entire meal. It's unknown exactly what the cause of his appetite was, but it can be guessed to be similar to that of Terrier, of more of a biological than a mental need. Dark web cannibal. It's been a while since we've talked about the dark web on the channel, because frankly I felt like we talked a little bit to death with red rooms and stuff, but this case is one of frankly the worst cases I've ever had to read. Alexander Nathan Barter was 23 and an active software developer when he was arrested for CSAM crimes. But in our point of interest today, in October of 2018, he posted an ad on a site on the dark web saying, "I'd like to try necrophilia and cannibalism and see how it feels to take a life. If you'd be willing to let me kill you, are in the US, preferably in the South, and can travel by car, contact me." Over the span of just 10 days, Alexander exchanged various messages with an undercover officer under the false premise of the officer having a 13-year-old child he was willing to let Alexander kill. According to the official limited press release of the crime, Alexander wanted the child to be sexually assaulted, killed, and then cannibalized. They staged a fake meeting where he was arrested, and once they searched him, they found a knife and a trash bag on his person. He was sentenced to 480 months in federal prison. Nathaniel Bar Jonah. Born David Brown, Nathaniel had a long history of psychosexual assaults dating all the way back to when he was just 7 years old, attacking other children, including strangling them. When he was 18 years old, he would lure an 8-year-old boy to his car claiming to be a police officer to assault and strangle him. Fortunately, a neighbor would see this and call the police. He would only be given a 1-year probation, and this did nothing but make him more brazen. 3 years later, Nathaniel would abduct 2 boys from the movies, once again claiming to be a cop. He handcuffed them, assaulted them, and strangled one of the boys, placing the other in the trunk of his car driving off. Somehow, the strangled boy was still alive and ran for help. Soon enough, Nathaniel was found with the other boy inside his trunk by officials. For this crime, he was sentenced to 18 to 20 years. While incarcerated, he discussed his violent, sadistic fantasies with a psychiatrist, who believed it would be best for him to be moved to a mental health facility. Later, in 1991, psych evaluations were put in front of a judge, deeming him non-dangerous for release, to which, for some insane reason, the judge agreed to releasing him on probation. And just days after his release, he saw a 7-year-old boy in a car alone. Nathaniel forced entry into the car and tried smothering the boy by sitting on top of him. Thankfully, the boy's mother came back, stopping him, having him arrested. Somehow, no one notified his probation officer, giving him the chance to flee and integrate into a small, quiet community. In 1999, he was arrested outside an elementary school, carrying a fake gun dressed as a police officer. And once they searched his home, they would find nothing but horrifying evidence of his abuse of hundreds of children, and even a piece of human bone. 3 years earlier, 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey had disappeared without a trace, and with everything they found, they highly suspected Nathaniel of killing him. As well as a journal detailing his plans to cook and eat children, with writings such as barbecued kid, sex a la carte, my little kid dessert, little boy stew, little boy pot pies, and lunch is served on the patio with roasted child. It's of note, a meat grinder was found in the apartment, and various neighbors recalled him feeding them meats that he claimed were from a deer he hunted. There was no record of Nathaniel ever being a hunter. There was not enough evidence to prove that he killed Zachary, or that he cannibalized him, but there sure was enough circumstantial evidence to make you wonder. He was ultimately sentenced to 130 years in prison for the molestation charges, and died in his cell in 2008 from cardiovascular disease. William Seabrook. Seabrook wrote in his travel book, Jungle Ways, that in the 20s while visiting Africa, he came across a tribe that ate human flesh, and that he himself partook as well, saying, "It was like good, fully developed veal. Not young, but not yet beef. It was very definitely like that. And it was not like any other meat I have ever tasted. It was so nearly like good, fully developed veal that I think no person with a palate of ordinary, normal sensitiveness could distinguish it from veal." Jesus fucking Christ, stop talking about veal. "It was mild, good meat, with no other sharply defined or highly characteristic tastes, such as, for instance, goat, high game, and pork calf. The rump steak was slightly tougher than prime veal, a little stringy, but not too tough, or stringy to be agreeably edible. The loin roast, from which I cut and ate a central slice, was tender, and in color, texture, smell, as well as taste, strengthened my certainty that of all the meats we habitually know, veal is the one meat to which this meat is accurately comparable." But, in all reality, this was a lie, and instead he had tried human flesh by convincing a medical intern at a university to give him a piece of meat, and that's where his description came from. But this only happened after he had initially said the entire beginning claim was, in fact, fictitious. So in all reality, we actually have no clue if he ever consumed human meat, as he off the bat was deceitful and seemingly came up with a secondary lie. Idi Amin. At times known as the Butcher of Africa, he ruled Uganda during the 70s for 8 years under a reign of terror. It's estimated he had ordered the killings of almost 300,000 people, but even some people estimate it was almost double this number. He fairly quickly rose through the ranks in the military until his eventual rule, and was well known for being a ruthless fighter, and later on, an extremely sadistic murderer. Even allegedly ordering that 4,000 disabled people be thrown into the Nile to be torn apart by crocodiles. Words started spreading that he was keeping human heads inside his personal refrigerator. He did on record confess on his partaking of cannibalism, saying, "I've eaten human meat. It is very salty, even more salty than leopard meat." Leningrad. While reports of cannibalism appeared during the winter of 1941, any records were not published or public until 2004, with most reference to the practice being perceived as anecdotal and used as an expression and tool of fear. even police in the area threatening uncooperative suspects with imprisonment in a cell with cannibals, as well as a man documenting a morbid nursery rhyme he heard his daughter sing at time. Dystrophic walked along with a dull look. In a basket he carried a corpse's arse. I'm having human flesh for lunch. This piece will do. Oh, hungry sorrow. And for supper, clearly I'll need a little baby. I'll take the neighbors, steal him out of his cradle. The first filed report of real instances of cannibalism taking place were 9 cases on December 13th of 1941. A report 10 days later mentions 13 cases that range from a mother smothering her 18-month-old baby to feed her other 3 children, to a plumber killing his wife to feed his sons and nieces. By December of 1942, they had arrested 2,105 cannibals, dividing them into 2 legal categories: corpse eating and person eating. Corpse eating is post-mortem cannibalization, eating of an already dead person, whereas person eating was killing someone in the means of cannibalization. The latter was usually shot, while the former were sent to prison. The Soviet criminal code had no provision for cannibalism, so all convictions were carried out under discretion. Instances of person eating were significantly lower than that of corpse eating. Of the 300 people arrested in April of 1942 for cannibalism, only 44 were murderers. 64% of cannibals were females, 44% were unemployed, 90% were illiterate or with only basic education, 15% were rooted inhabitants, and only 2% had any criminal record. St. Francis Raid. This was an attack during the French and Indian War on what was the French province of Canada. One widely reported account of cannibalism was recounted to historian Thomas Monti by Lieutenant George Campbell, in which his party of men came upon scalped remains trapped in logs on a small river, devouring part of them raw, because they were too impatient to wait for a fire. Robert Kirkwood, in a relatively unadorned account, tells how Rogers killed one of their prisoners, an Indian woman, butchered her remains, and divided them amongst his men to eat. Cannibal Cop. I actually used to have like a crazy 1 hour long video about this, which rip to that, but I find this case so utterly fascinating because this is truly, I think, one of the key pieces of showing when fantasy starts to become reality and the shift within an individual when they choose to escalate, as well as the abuse of power within the legal system from police officers. Gilberto Vale had a self-obsession with girl meat and his fantasy of wanting to kidnap, kill, and cook a woman in an oven, but particularly a certain single woman he was friends with in college. I will be not naming her for privacy's sake. He was a member of the NYPD, earning him the name of Cannibal Cop in the media. He was extremely active on the private member-only site, Dark Edishnet, where he would spend entire nights discussing his fantasies with others just feet away from his wife and child. He even created a document titled Abducting and Cooking Victim Blank, a blueprint that contained her name, date of birth, height, weight, bra size, and a list of materials needed, including a car, chloroform, and rope. At one point, he drove just 4 hours out to meet her, during this entire fantasy world he was living in online, talking to other individuals about killing and eating her, as well as using his police database access to look up the woman's information that would be available only to those in the police force, a direct violation of rights and his power. She wouldn't be the only woman he discussed the abduction of on the site. When speaking to another member, he mentioned selling his wife's friends to this man for only $5,000. This case falls under what some refer to as a thought crime, that he was arrested on the pretense of thought and fantasy and not action, but we can clearly show his illegal and unprofessional usage of police technology to advance his fantasies, or even advance his escalation into the possibly real-world crime. There's a documentary on this case I recommend checking out if you're further interested, titled Thought Crimes, Case of a Cannibal Cop. Famine in Moscow, 1612. The famine in Moscow during 1612 was part of the broader crisis known as the Time of Troubles, exacerbated by the Polish-Lithuanian occupation and ongoing conflicts. Food shortages led to severe suffering, including instances of hunger and cannibalism among the population. Russian historian Avramry Palestine claims that after they entered into the Kremlin Corsacks, they discovered salted human flesh, quote, and under the slings there is a lot of human corpse, unquote. This is suggesting that they had resorted to cannibalism when the food supplies had ran out. Human empanadas. Now, believe it or not, there is far more than just one case of people being turned into empanadas, but as this entire iceberg has hyperlinks, this one is referring to the 2016 Brazilian human empanadas event, so that's the one I'm going to discuss with you. Not the one that was mentioned in the Ogrish magazine. Just I know at least 3 cases of this happening now. 3 people, a man, his wife, and his mistress, were arrested under suspicion of killing at least 2 women they lured to their home under the guise of a nanny job, as well as the butchering and cannibalization of their bodies, eventually turning them into empanadas they sold, which was confirmed by the wife once arrested. All 3 said they were members of a small group or cult of just the trio they called the cartel, and that a voice had commanded them to kill women they considered evil to keep the purification of the world and the reduction of its population. Once arrested, the police found the bodies of the 2 women buried in their backyard. Shortly after this, outraged members of the community set the house ablaze. In 2019, after already being charged and sentenced, the court ordered for an increase of penalty, which was granted. The husband was sentenced to serve 27 years and 1.5 years solitary, and the 2 women were sentenced to 24 years each. Grandpa's ashes cookies. You heard me right. For some fucking reason, a 16-year-old thought, while making sugar cookies, Kane... While making sugar cookies, I should put my grandpa's ashes in it. And not just bake them and do that for myself, but bring them to school and feed them to 9 other children. Some who knew and some who did not know the cookies contained ashes. Now, this happening at a school and how teenagers are, quickly word got around that someone brought cookies with ashes. This got to the resource officer where they escalated it, and the police actually took cookies, examined them, and found there were, in fact, human ashes in said cookies. One of the kids who ate the cookies said it tasted like how it feels when you eat sand. I can't imagine being this girl's mother and getting this call from the school. And not only did she bake them into cookies, but one student said at a previous time, she asked to switch seats, and in reward for the other student switching seats with her, she offered to give them some ashes. And pulled an urn out. At school. Just pulled her grandpa's urn out. Kids, am I right? Human fat meatballs. We're really in the home cook section right now, aren't we, guys? Marco Avisti is a Chilean shock artist, we could say. He has no fear in doing dark installations or creations around death, humans, blood, nastiness, any of the above. I think his most famous installation is called Helena, which in the year 2000 was 10 blenders plugged in, filled with goldfish, live goldfish, where people who came to the museum were encouraged to turn the blenders on, killing the fish. And I wish I was kidding. Obviously, animal activists and kind of everybody were not happy with this, to the point that the curator for the museum was actually tried for animal cruelty. He was put off. He didn't get charged with anything. Kane really just said he's not getting enough screen time lately in videos. But for our discussion, we're talking about a much more intimate art piece, which was a dinner party he hosted in 2007, where he created a pasta for the main dish that was topped with a meatball crafted with his own fat that was removed during a liposuction procedure, which it's kind of funny to be like, I have to get lipo for this art piece. Which, man, if I had a nickel for every time a artist has removed parts of them and then cooked them for a dinner party and fed them to people, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot. But it's weird that it happened twice. And he still creates shock art literally to this year. In March of 2025, he did an installation in Denmark that was supposed to be commenting on the meat trade and the animal cruelty that partakes in that, with having 3 piglets starve to death at the exhibit. Believe it or not, people did not like this. An animal activist actually broke in, stole the said piglets, and he at first was very disappointed, but ultimately said on the record, but then I thought about it for a few hours and realized that at least the way the piglets would have a happy life. So there's that. Dude, whatever. I don't even care anymore, bro. Jess Saunders. Jess is a tattoo artist living in Australia who posted a photo of Instagram of her removed skin from her forehead that came from a scarification body modification surgery, where pieces of flesh are cut with a scalpel, removing the section to leave behind a scar, typically in the shape of a design or pattern. The skin from this was placed on her tongue, which drew an insane amount of attention online. Within the surgical body modification subculture, and more specifically when it comes to scarification, it is an extremely common practice that once your skin is removed, you're presented with the option to either consume it or for it to be properly discarded of. I myself have taken the practice, after a small scarification procedure, to eat my own removed skin. It may sound insane to you, but it is quite normal for body modification people. So I guess this is me coming out as an auto-cannibal. Custom of the sea. This is in reference to what I kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about ships and cannibalism, is things that just kind of become normal or take place at the sea. There are a lot of customs at the sea, but again, we're talking cannibalism. And cannibalism became so prevalent during ships that they literally used, unbeknownst to the dude, they would bring someone on board under the guise of being food if things got rough. I'm not kidding. This happened and became such a prevalent occurrence that they literally had to create laws against it so people stopped doing this. Otoko Saburo Nogoshi was a Japanese murderer and suspected serial killer. He moved into his brother-in-law's home, which he did not have a good relationship with, to live with his wife, Sei, who was having to take care of her brother due to his leprosy. In a means of wanting to improve his relationship with his brother-in-law, he searched for a cure. As I mentioned earlier, a belief in corpse medicine was that a cure to leprosy was eating human flesh. So Nogoshi decided he was going to kill a child and feed him to his brother-in-law. On the night of March 27, 1902, Nogoshi strangled an 11-year-old boy to death who was walking home from buying sugar. He took his body into an empty lot, where he stabbed him post-mortem in the face. Following this, by cutting large incisions on each buttocks, removing the muscle tissue from them. Before fleeing, for an unknown reason, he as well removed the eyeballs from the young boy with his bare fingers. In a means of hiding the evidence of what he was really going to feed his brother-in-law, 2 days after this, he bought a pod, rented a rungboat, and sailed out to an area to cook the flesh of the young boy. Once returning to shore with the now cooked meat, he purchased a pre-made soup from a store, mixing the flesh he cooked into it, disguising it. 2 years later, his wife would give birth to their daughter in July, and by December they got into fights about their prenup, causing him to leave them and the home they shared with his brother-in-law. By May the following year, it was clear there's no reconciling, and his wife informed him that their daughter was now under custody of her brother. This information caused Nogoshi to decide that he must kill his brother-in-law. He bought poisonous capsules and attempted to trick his wife into giving them to her brother, but failed to do so. He then later snuck into their home and shoved the capsules down his brother-in-law's throat, choking him until he died. After his brother-in-law's death, as no one knew at the time it was at his hands, he began begging his wife's family to accept him back into it, which they did not do so. Even with this, he tried to pass himself off as a representative of the family, seemingly selling fake investment plans, which eventually a drugstore owner would fall for this lie. And on May 14th, Nogoshi strangled him to death and dumped his body in a forest. He was quickly deemed a suspect and when questioned, almost immediately admitted to all 3 murders. He was sentenced to death and hung in 1908. Johann de Witt. Johann was a major political figure during what was known as the Dutch Golden Age, due to their lead in trading and seafaring across Europe. This, of course, would bring enemies. Eventually, England and France declared war on the Dutch Republic. During this, Johann was wounded by a knife-wielding assassin. After this attack, his brother, who was immensely hated, was arrested in what appeared to be false charges of treason. He was tortured, but still refused to confess to the crime. He was ultimately sentenced to exile, but something much worse would happen. Johann went to see his brother in jail before he was sent away, but the two were quickly attacked by members of a militia and subsequently shot, and then left to a mob. Their now dead bodies were stripped naked and strung up publicly, where members of the mob cut out and ate their livers. There's a painting depicting the bodies of the brothers after this titled The Corpses of the De Witt Brothers. Werewolf of Bedburg. Peter Stump was a German serial killer in the 16th century, accused of being a witch, werewolf, and cannibal. His crimes are still known due to 2 16-page pamphlets surviving that were originally published in 1590. One is now housed in the British Museum, and the other in the Lambeth Library. He had one of the most famous werewolf trials documented. He was stretched on a rack in a means of getting a confession, to which he said he'd been practicing black magic since the age of 12, and that the devil gave him a special belt that would cause him to transform into a wolf when worn, telling the officials he had left it somewhere. They sent people looking for it, never to recover. A devil belt. With the threat of torture until death, he, as well, confessed to killing and eating 14 children and 2 pregnant women, even claiming that he ripped the fetuses out of 2 of their wombs, and that he ate their hearts panting hot and raw, even saying one of these children he ate was his own son that he took into the woods and killed after transforming into a wolf, eating his brain. Ultimately, Peter was sentenced to death, along with his daughter, who he was accused of having an incestuous relationship with, as well as his mistress. The two women were strangled and flayed, whereas Peter was put on a medieval dice called the wheel, his flesh torn apart, while his arms and head were removed with the blunt end of an axe, and all three were burned. Joe Metheny. Joe claimed to have upwards of 13 victims, but only evidence of 3 have ever been proven. In 1994, Joe was living with his girlfriend and their 6-year-old son in Baltimore, working as a truck driver. He was gone for long periods of time, and when he came home from a trip, he found his girlfriend and their son gone. Both drug addicts, he went around various hotspots in town looking for her. He eventually came across 2 homeless men under a bridge, who he believed knew his girlfriend, but after they adamantly said they didn't, Joe killed the 2 with an axe. He panicked and dumped their bodies in the river. He was arrested for the murders and spent a year and a half in county awaiting trial until his eventual acquittal due to lack of evidence and the fact that they never retrieved the 2 bodies of the men. Shortly after being released, Metheny murdered 2 stalkers when they failed to provide him with information on his missing girlfriend. Instead of tossing them in the river, Metheny brought the bodies home. There, he dismembered them, stored the meatiest parts of them in Tupperware containers, and the pieces of them that did not fit he buried in a truck lot owned by the company he worked for. Over the next several weekends, he mixed the flesh of the women he murdered with beef and pork, forming them into patties. He would sell these patties out of a small barbecue stand he opened on the side of the road. Quote, "The human body tastes very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference. So the next time you're riding down the road and you happen to see an open pit beef stand that you've never seen before, make sure you think about the story before you take a bite out of that sandwich." Unquote. Once being caught in 1996, after a would-be victim was able to escape, he quickly admitted to the murders. He was found guilty by the court and sentenced to death, but this was later overturned, and he was given 2 life sentences. But in 2017, he was found dead in his cell. Effet-la-Tableau was a military operation carried out during the Second Congo War between October 2002 and January of 2003. They used terror as their main weapon of war, committing serious violations against human rights, including senseless executions, rape, and torture. As well, there were reports of cannibalism being widespread. It's estimated that 60,000 to 70,000 Pygmy people were killed in this campaign. First Crusade Cannibals. This is in reference to the Siege of Maria that occurred in late 1098 in what is modern-day Syria. During or after the siege, the Crusaders had begun cannibalization from the lack of food. There's conflicting accounts on if the cannibalism took place during or after the attack. But one thing is for sure, with the various accounts we have, there is little to no doubt that they ate the flesh of their killed enemies. Once again, with varied accounts, some suggest that beyond consuming the dead from starvation, it was also a tool of fear against the people. That instead of the consumption of the dead being done with shame or in secret, it was done brazenly for all to see. One account saying, a lack of food compelled them to make a meal of human flesh, that adults were put in the stew pot and that children were skewered on spits. Both were cooked and eaten. Reverend Thomas Baker. Thomas was a Methodist missionary that went to Fiji in the means of converting the people in 1867. It's believed that when meeting a local chief, he gave a comb, what was out of apparently goodwill, but more so, it seems, a bribe of interest into joining the Christian faith. When it became apparent the people would not be converted, Thomas attempted to take the comb back from the chief. During this process, he touched the head of the chief, an act deemed extremely disrespectful in the culture. In turn, the chief granted a whale tooth to a fellow clan to take care of the reverend. Him and 7 other Fijian Christian missionary workers were killed and cannibalized. Over a century later, descendants from both sides would meet for the Fijians to do a symbolic ritual of cutting the chain after apologizing for the previous act. Asmat Tribe. The Asmats are an indigenous group in New Guinea. They practice one of the most well-known wood carving traditions. If this name is sounding familiar to you, it's due to the fact that this is the tribe that Michael Rockefeller was visiting with missionaries and is suspected of being cannibalized by. The Asmat people were well-known headhunters that partook in cannibalism, which successfully kept the people fairly left alone. Headhunting was an extremely important element of their culture. Any death of an adult in the tribe was believed to have been caused by an enemy, which led to the need of revenge against those they believed caused it. As well, the heads of killed enemies played part in ritual practice for them, including the transition of boys into manhood, which in all reality it seems that the cannibalism was really an after-the-fact thought, just a means of the product they already had. They were more interested in having the head for their beliefs, and why waste the flesh or meat if they had it around, and no longer needed this said body part for ritual. Otaku murderer. Osamu Miyazaki was a Japanese serial killer. He killed 4 young girls aged 4 to 7 in Tokyo from August of 1988 to June of 1989. He would abduct the girls into his car before killing, dismembering, and assaulting their corpses. He's called the Otaku murderer due to his extensive amount of anime and manga he owned. His first victim was a 9-year-old girl, Mari Kono, who after killing her, he dumped her body only to return after decomposition set in to cut off her hands and feet, to which he placed them in his closet to sit until they were found after his arrest. This wasn't enough for him though. He burned her remains, ground them into powder, and sent them to the little girl's family, along with her teeth, photos of the clothes she was seen last in, and a card that read, Mari, bones, cremated, investigate, prove. 2 months later, he would abduct, kill, and necrophile Masame, a 7-year-old girl, and just 2 months after this, on December 12th of 1988, he abducted 4-year-old Erica, this time forcing her to disrobe, take photos of her inside his car, and his now established MO. Just 8 days after killing, he would send a postcard to her family saying, Erica, cold, cough, throat, rest, death. Then on June 6th of 1989, Miyazaki convinced 5-year-old Aiko to allow him to take photos of her. He then took her to his car, murdered her, placing her body into the trunk of the car and subsequently taking her body into his apartment, necrophiling the young girl for the next 2 days while taking various photos and videos during this. He then dismembered her body, keeping her hands to drink the blood from and cannibalizing the flesh on them. Just over 2 weeks later, he would be caught after taking nude photos of a young girl that he led away from the park by the father of the girl. The father then contacted the police and they located Miyazaki. Once investigating his home, they quickly came across photos of the previous victims. During trial, he tried to blame his actions on his alter ego he called Ratman. This obviously did nothing for his case, and he was sentenced to death and hung on June 17th of 2008. Leopard Society. These were what secret societies operating in Central Africa from the late 19th to 20th century were commonly referred to. The representation and references made by other cultures about leopard societies and leopard men were blatantly racist, and the overemphasis of war and violence, depicting them as constantly intoxicated, aggressive, flesh-eating, and unpredictable. Almost every source referencing leopard men societies as practicing cannibalism are for the colonial era, which they were a seemingly direct threat to around the societal overtaking of the areas. This is a common practice in history, where those that are deemed aggressive or from another culture are now labeled as cannibals, when in reality there is nothing of the sort occurring. In all reality, these groups are a way of maintaining local power relations, performing indigenous justice in secret, and circumventing colonial government control. Tafurs. The Tafurs were a group of Christian members of the First Crusade, as mentioned earlier. They were those that partook in cannibalism during the Siege of Moray, so I find no need to repeat the matter at the moment. The Jeon family. The Jeon family was a South Korean gang active for just 1 year, from 1993 to 1994. It was a group of younger men that overtook the societal system, and more specifically, they were angry at the wealthy, so they decided to devise ways to trap, extort, and kill rich people in the area. Their doctrine was, we hate the rich, a traitor to the group must be killed. Do not trust women, not even your mother. In total, they killed 5 people and assaulted 2 women, even at one point forcing a woman to kill her own boyfriend, as they wrongly imprisoned the 2, believing them to be wealthy individuals when they were not, and the gang tracking down and killing a runaway member. When it came to cannibalism, only one member admitted on record to the consumption, Kim Yang. He said on the record he was the only one who partook, and that he did it because he wanted to do away with humanity. His only regret was that he didn't get to kill all the rich people. As well, one of the women they assaulted that ended up getting away with her life claims that they forced her to eat the liver of a man. Cannibal Cafe. Cannibal Cafe has its name wrongfully dragged through the mud and associated with Armin Mize, which, as I mentioned earlier, he did not find his victim on Cannibal Cafe. It was one of the literal 60 places he put an ad out. So this got associated with it. But Cannibal Cafe was a cannibal role-playing forum which existed under the giant umbrella of necrobabes.com, which necrobabes.com and all of the sites it hosted is my biggest obsession with old internet and intrigue, and I literally go on the web archive and try to look at as much stuff as I can because it literally fascinates my brain so much, and I can't talk to you about almost any of it because of the platform we're on. And I want to say right now, I'm not making a Patreon. I don't have time for a Patreon. Stop mentioning a Patreon, please, from the bottom of my little dead heart. It's not happening. Okay, so we get what we get for right now. Later on, listen, y'all need to be sharing my videos. You want a Patreon? I need to be able to do this. I need to allocate more time for this, but I need a reason to. So Just mentioning that. South Sudanese Civil War. The South Sudanese Civil War is a multi-sided civil war in South Sudan, fought from 2013 to 2020, between forces of the government and oppositional forces. The Civil War caused rampant human rights abuses, including forced displacement, ethnic massacres, and killing of journalists by various parties. Some witnesses say they saw draining human blood from people who had just been killed and forcing others from one ethnic community to drink the blood or eat burnt human flesh. Kony LRA. Kony was a Ugandan warlord that received massive online attention for his war crimes with an internet campaign launched in 2012 to take him down called Kony 2012. All I can find on the matter when it comes to cannibalism is that in a court case having reference to someone who was under his command ordering, on at least one occasion, to kill, cook, and eat civilians. Mary of Beth Azab. The story is in the book The Jewish War, written by a 1st century Roman Jewish historian. Specifically, Mary is in Jerusalem when a siege is taking place, resulting in no food and people participating in survival cannibalism. It specifically says, famine was eating her heart out and rage consuming her still faster. Maddened by hunger, she took the infant at her breast and said to him, "Poor little mite, in war, famine, and civil strife, why should I keep you alive? With the Romans, there is only slavery, and that is only if alive when they come. But famine is forestalling slavery, and the partisans are crueler than either. Come, you must be food for me. To the partisans an avenging spirit, and to the world a tale. The only thing left to fill up the measure of Jewish misery. And in defiance to all natural feeling, she killed her son, then roasted him and ate one half, hiding the rest." Almost immediately, the rebels appeared, sniffing the unholy smell, and threatened to kill her on the spot unless she revealed what she had prepared. As she uncovered what was left of the child, she offered them a share. They left her in horror, and the entire city could not stop thinking of this crime and abomination. James Jameson sketches. Putting it simply, in the 1880s, the heir to the Jameson whiskey family fortune bought a 10-year-old girl just so he could draw her being eaten alive by cannibals. James, like many rich white men in the 1800s, fancied himself a world traveler and would join an expedition that ended up trailing him through the Congos. According to Asad Farhan, a Sudanese translator on the trip, Jameson expressed interest in seeing the cannibalism firsthand. It's then said that Jameson paid 6 handkerchiefs to the tribe's chief, to which a 10-year-old girl was produced. The chief then said to the villagers, "This is a present from a white man who wishes to see her eaten." And then, according to accounts after this, the girl was tied to a tree, the natives sharpened their knives, the while one of them stabbed her twice in the belly. In Jameson's own personal diary, he wrote, 3 men then ran forward and began to cut up the body of the girl. Finally, her head was cut off, and not a particle remained, each man taking his piece away down the river to wash it. As this occurred, James sketched in his book the brutal killing and later watercolored them. When returning home, him and his wife had tried to play it off that they didn't know they would actually kill a girl, even later trying to state that this never happened at all. But with the ample evidence, it is without a doubt a fact that James Jameson paid to see a girl killed and eaten. Andre Chikatilo.
Of living partner. Andrew Chikatilo, nicknamed the Red Ripper, is a man who would fall into multiple necrophilic categories. Necromutilomaniacs, homicidal necrophiles, and of course, exclusive necrophile. He brutally killed a 9-year-old girl in 1978 after his failed attempt of assaulting her. After this incident, he concluded he could only become excited and reach when stabbing and mutilating women and children to death. This would lead to the murder of over 50 individuals. He created a pattern of getting his victims by tricking them into coming with him that he knew a shortcut or he had food or candy. He would go out of his way to lure children or runaways or immigrant workers, people that he knew were vulnerable to being attacked and people who objectively couldn't fight back or had less people who would be looking for them. He maliciously picked out victims more often than not at train stops or places like that to then lure them away. Because of how absolutely brutal he was with their bodies, the Soviet Union believed the murders to have been done by a group of organ harvesters or a satanic cult. In one instance, he led a 10-year-old girl named Olga away from a bus station. Chikatilo then lured the girl to a cornfield on the outskirts of the city, stabbed her over 50 times around the head and body, ripped open her chest, and pulled out her lower bowel and uterus. He, along with this, would cut out the eyes of multiple victims due to the old superstition in Eastern Europe that if someone was murdered, the last thing their eyes would hold was the face of their killer. He, more often than not, would also lay with his victims, listening to their heartbeat until it ended, and then would continue the violations to their bodies. He would be arrested and confess fully to the crimes 12 years after his first murder in 1990. That would give him an average of almost 5 murders a year. And not just murders, brutal, vicious mutilations of individuals.
General Butt Naked. This was the name of a warlord during the First Liberian Civil War that lasted between 1989 and 1997, where it's most noted for the extensive use of child soldiers and the heinous acts of brutality. Born Joshua Balai, he had formed his own group of soldiers known as Naked Base Commandos or Butt Naked Brigade. This was dozens of children, some as young as just 9 years old. He gained his name by being seen almost exclusively nude except for shoes and talisman, believing this practice would make him and his child fighters immune to bullets. It said he was constantly feeding them drugs and explaining that killing people was a game, using fictional movies to promote this idea. He claims the devil came to him saying that rituals of child sacrifice and cannibalism would bring him more power. It is worth noting that he is now a preacher, and it appears these statements have come since the career change. He has as well lied numerous times on his death toll and his life. The belief was that by killing and eating children, the soldiers would be strengthened and purified for the battle, and that there has been recounting that he would cut the hearts out of people and immediately consume them. There isn't much hard documentation on exactly when, where, and how, but without a doubt, it does appear that he was cannibalizing their victims and most likely forcing his child soldiers to do so as well. Cannibal Hymn. This is the hymn that was found inscribed in the tomb of Pharaoh Unix and his successor Pharaoh Tidi. The inscription of text, hymns, and symbols in the tomb were a standard procedure. This one particularly is, Pharaoh is he who lives on the being of every god, who eats their entrails. Pharaoh is he who eats men and lives on gods. The cannibal hymn is included among the pyramid texts of the Middle Kingdom. A later reworked version appears as coffin text spell 573, while a variety of phrases and themes from the hymn also occur in other coffin texts. The curses of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. The curses are threats in relation to if the followers of God go against him, with Leviticus stating, Leviticus 26:29, you shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. Whereas Deuteronomy 28:58 states, you shall eat your own issue, the flesh of your sons and daughters, that Yahweh your God has assigned to you, because of the desperate straits to which your enemy shall reduce you. Now, cannibalism is an ever-present threat or even just occurrence in the Torah and Bible, with Ezekiel having Ezekiel 5:9. On account of all your abominations, I will do among you what I have never done, and the like of which I will never do again. 5:10. Assuredly parents shall eat their children in your midst, and children shall eat their parents. I will execute judgments against you, and I will scatter all your survivors in every direction. And when it comes to occurrences as mentioned in the previous tier with Mary and the siege taking place in Jerusalem, Lamentations on the siege and destruction of Israel said, Lamentations 2:20, alas, women eat their own fruit, their newborn babes. Lamentations 4:10, with their own hands, tender-hearted women have cooked their children. Such become their fare in the disaster of my poor people. As mentioned, the Torah and the Bible are littered with occurrences and references to cannibalism, figurative, literally, historically, and allegorically. If you would like to see me go more in depth about biblical cannibalism, make sure to let me know down below. Powdered Pregnant Pilgrim. This is when I mentioned earlier we're going to get to Jamestown again and a case of non-necromutilation. Guys, I have to be on a plane in 3 hours and I haven't packed for it, so. What time is it? It's 2:33 a.m.? Woo! Powdered Pregnant Pilgrim. This is in reference once again to Jamestown. In this case, this is not necro-cannibalism. This is in reference to a man who killed, salted, I can't find much information on the quotations around the word salted, but killed, salted, and ate his pregnant wife. And this is not a joke. This was documented by at least 2 of very reliable people at the time, including the official that is Captain John Smith, which, yes, that John Smith, wrote down on record about this, saying, one amongst the rest did kill his wife, powdered her, and had eaten part of her before it was known, for which he was executed, as he well deserved. Now whether she was better roasted, boiled, or barbecued, I know not, but of such a dish as powdered wife I never heard of. Which, did everyone speak this, like, lyrically back then? Or was it just this dude? Because I don't know, I'm like, that kind of reads like a poem in a way. But as I mentioned before, the idea of cannibalism at Jamestown was just a hypothetical thrown out, so until the findings of Jane and her skull fragments and the evidence of her butcherment and consumption. So historians actually kind of were like, did this really happen? Is this allegorical? Like, what's going on? But once we had the evidence that cannibalism 100% was institutionalized for survival means, this 100% happened. A man in Jamestown killed his wife, and ate her while she was pregnant with their child, and Jamestown executed him, as they said, rightfully so. Wine of the corpse. Endocannibalism, as mentioned, is eating those of your own community. This goes beyond survival cannibalism and is almost always in reference to mortuary or funerary cannibalism. Wine of the corpse is a term used to describe the practice itself, due to the fact that it can be described similarly to the creation of wine, especially when it comes to the aforementioned Wari people. The ritual process begins by placing the body of the deceased onto racks to encourage decomposition. Once the body reaches a state referred to as melarak, when it becomes quite bloated and dripping with fluid, the body is then cut at the shoulders and placed into a large container and stored into the kitchen for further fermentation. Once the fermentation process was completed, the liquid and solid remains of the deceased were separated. The solids were buried and the liquids were kept for consumption. As mentioned earlier, the Wari believed this was a way to free the spirit of the loved one from being stuck wandering the earth. It was an act of immense love and care, an extremely long process of honoring their body after death. Although practices like this may seem some sort of horrific horror movie practice for you, this is an extensive, giant display of the love and care they held for someone and ties directly into their cultural beliefs. People's practices with the dead, and especially funerary practices, is a giant look into the culture. As well, there is a piece written in 1987 titled Wine of the Corpses, Endocannibalism and the Great Feast of the Dead in Burano. Takanawa Incident. Takanawa was a surrender by an Imperial Japanese Army battalion that occurred on May 3rd of 1945, near the end of the Pacific War. There was a suspicion that directly before they surrendered, Takanawa's unit ate the body of one of the villagers from Tao who had been killed in the fighting there, and the Australian Army decided to investigate. When they interrogated the prisoners from Takanawa's unit, they received statements indicating that some of the unit had been involved in eating the villager, but that the soldiers responsible had since died. It was noted that all of the soldiers they came across looked extremely healthy for people that had been stranded with no resources. So there was nothing to do but suspect the case with no evidence backing it. But since then, there have been records from survivors written after the war admitting that they themselves were involved in cannibalization. Mortuary feasts. As discussed earlier surrounding the Fore tribe that were affected by the Kuro disease, this occurred in what was due to their mortuary feast practices, which of course is the consumption of the dead for their funerary rites, a practice of endocannibalism. One of the major reasons for the feast was the Fore's belief in the 5 souls that all interacted with each other, and for parts to meet for the afterlife continuation of the dead, a funerary feast had to be held for them. The body was laid on a bed of edible greens on a tapa cloth placed on banana leaves. This was to ensure that when the body was cut up, nothing was lost on the ground, as this would have been disrespectful for the deceased, and it would have affected part of the 5 souls. The body was divided amongst those that had rights to it. The processing of the body was something they tried to keep out of view of everybody, and more particularly of the children. When the torso was about to be cut open, the older women formed a wall around the body using their back capes, so that the younger women and children did not see the intestines when they were removed. The flesh was mostly consumed by women, which is why they were the ones that were so affected by the Kuro disease. It was a multiple-day process of consumption. More times than not, these were the widows that would then have to take the leftover parts to their home, where other women from their tribe and other tribes would come to mourn with them, continuously eating the body until there was nothing left. Scarlet Memorial. Scarlet Memorial, Tales of Cannibalism in Modern China, Zheng, uses local government documents, eyewitness accounts, and confessions to describe the factional violence and even cannibalism that occurred in the Gongjai Massacre during the Cultural Revolution, which we discussed in the Mengshin Country entry. Bloody Benders. The Bender family was a family of serial killers consisting of John and Elvira, yes, that was her name, that is not a bit, and their 2 children, John Jr. and Kate. They had turned half their home into an inn for travelers, where it would be the final stop of many. It said that when the guests were seated at the place of honor at the dining table, the 2 men of the family would stand behind the curtain, right behind the guest's chair, and strike them on the head with a giant hammer. The Bender family is believed to have committed around 21 murders in the span of around 2 years, even allegedly burying an infant alive. The real issue for us discussing this is that I cannot find a single mention of cannibalism. My guess of why it's on this list is the fact that this family was able to kill for so long because no one could find any of these bodies. So I'm gonna guess the implication is that they were in fact cannibalizing the people they killed. But from the multiple verifiable resources I have found, I cannot find anything about them cannibalizing them. If you have any information on this, make sure to leave it down below. Chichima Incident. And yes, I know I mixed up the George Bushes when I mentioned the Chichima Incident in the deep dive cannibalism video. Sorry, I mixed up 2 horrible white presidents with literally the same name who both served before I was cognitive and even when I was not alive, okay? I'm sorry. But in 1944, 8 American prisoners of war were murdered by Japanese soldiers, and as well they were cannibalized. At least 4 of them were confirmed cannibalized. 9 men, though, had escaped from their planes after being shot down in a bomb raid, ending up on the island, with only one 20-year-old pilot successfully escaping. This being former U.S. President George H.W. Bush. The crime was investigated and tried in 1947 as part of a massive war crime trial, and those Japanese soldiers were found guilty and hung on multiple charges. Ratu udre udre. So the word cannibal, as you may know from me or other parts of the internet, is actually a geological word. It originally came from explorers saying that the Carabiles, or the Caribs, were full of these savage cannibals that would kill and eat you, and you don't want to go there. And of course, this was a racist lie that was perpetrated time and time again. And over time, when speaking Carib, they became Caribs, and then they became Carabal, and then they became Cannibal, and then they became cannibals, and now we have this word cannibal, and this actually comes from them. And this entry is in reference to a leader in the Fiji Isles, which was part of the Caribs in this discussion we are having right now, where they say he was the most insatiable cannibal. He was in the north area of the largest island of Fiji, and he said that he used rocks to count how many human bodies he ate. The people he ate were said to be victims in wars fought, and that he never shared his meals with anyone. Most of what we know of him came directly from the recounting of his life by his son. He said that when the chiefs would go into battle alongside Udre, they would gift him all of their dead bodies of their kills, and that Udre ate nothing but human flesh. And with what he couldn't eat at the time being fresh, he would save in a box for later. It's believed that Udre ate somewhere between 872 and 999 people in his lifetime, earning him the honor of being named Guinness World Record's most prolific cannibal. Holodomor, also known as the Ukraine famine. This was a man-made famine, which this being declared a genocide is debated, but it is a fact that the famine was an occurrence made by the Soviet Union, leading to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians, on purpose or not. Ukraine was one of the largest grain-producing states in the USSR, and was subject to unreasonably high grain quotas compared to the rest of the USSR in 1930, leading to a giant shortage for the people. From the book Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, relating to the crimes taking place in Europe, survival was a moral as well as physical struggle. A woman doctor wrote to a friend in June of 1933 that she had not yet become a cannibal, but was not sure that I shall not be one by the time my letter reaches you. At least 2,505 people were sentenced for cannibalism in the years between 1932 and 1933 in Ukraine, though the actual number of cases was certainly much higher. And on the topic of it being a moral struggle, as well as many cases were of the already dead being consumed, there were also many documented cases of people killing their children for food. It was alarmingly prevalent. Even one woman who had been arrested for this explained it was simply her child would not survive anyway, but this way she would. Those arrested and found guilty of cannibalism were often imprisoned, executed, or lynched. With the almost complete lack of grains and protein, there was as well the start of an alleged black market of buying human meat. With even in March of 1933, a police sect reported that there were 10 or more reports of cannibalism every day. But in reality, there are many more such incidents. The famine and the cannibalism was not unknown to Moscow. Reports were filed and sent to just sit unanswered and cared for, except for the concern of the news getting around outside of the country, with the police warning saying that written notes on the subject do not circulate among the officials where they might cause rumors. Later on, the Soviet Union even tried denying that it ever occurred, and any discussion of the famine was banned entirely. Pregnancy flesh cravings. I think it's more than common knowledge nowadays that pregnant women get weird cravings, and in this instance, we're talking more than pickles and peanut butter. Pregnant women will get cravings for non-food items such as soil, coal, styrofoam, and in this case, human flesh. Falun Gong organ harvesting. Falun Gong is a religious group or movement, or frankly cult. Take your pick. Reports on the possibility of forced organ harvesting taking place in the group started appearing in the public in 2006. All numbers I'm about to give you came from various independent researchers, but it has been estimated that over 41,500 organ transplants in China were unexplained between 2000 and 2005, and it's been suggested that the source were Falun Gong practitioners. Journalist Ethan Gutman began investigating the claims in 2006 and published his research in subsequent years. He's estimated that 65,000 Falun Gong practitioners have been killed between 2000 and 2008 specifically for their organs. An informal independent tribunal initiated by an advocacy group made a final judgment in 2019 that forced organ harvesting had occurred in China on a significant scale and continue to do so, and Falun Gong practitioners are the primary source. These reports are a mixture of interviews with prisoners, medical professionals, and statistic analyses with the backing of the fact that China's organ transplant numbers absolutely skyrocketed post-1999 in correlation with the beginning of the rumors of the illegal harvesting. The Chinese government has denied harvesting organs, but admitted that executed prisoners were once used legally as well as illegally as a source of organs for transplantation. Execution harvesting. Now, this is in reference to harvesting the executed, as it may sound, which this had a variety of reasons. From medical students wanting to do examinations, parts being used for medicine, or even people turning skin and other parts into the most morbid trinkets one could think of. But for us, it's really about criminal corpse medicine, which a large focus of was the drinking of blood of an executed man. To ancient Galenic medicine, which held sway through much of the early modern period, blood was one of the four humors, and so sometimes more or less blood was required to restore health. And as mentioned earlier with the gladiator blood, it was thought to cure epilepsy. Some 18th and 19th century German and Scandinavian depictions of execution blood drinking show that ingestion of blood alone was considered insufficient to effect a cure, but this didn't stop them from doing it. There would be, at times, rows of people waiting to try to consume the blood of a man who was newly killed. Battle of Suyang. This is in reference to a previous entry about Zhang Yun, who refused to concede to the Yuan, and ultimately, once they ran out of food, killed his own concubine to feed his men, and eventually everyone in the city who wasn't an able-bodied man. Flesh pills. Certain Tibetan monks who as recently as the 1500s ritually consumed pills of flesh, collected from Brahmin ascetics, and left extensive written documentation of the theory behind the practice. This theory turns out to be extraordinarily multi-layered and complex, but it boils down to the idea that these flesh pills bridge the boundary between subject and object, serving as ritual tokens that embody the compassion of past Buddhas, while also reminding the eater of the transient nature of his own mortal flesh. Mellified man. Back again to medical cannibalism. At least this one is a bit different in the fact that this does surround mummies, again, kind of in a way, but this actually is more often than not documented as a consensual or even sacrificial practice. Their bodies would be soaked, embalmed, mummified, however you want to say it, in vats of honey that would be turned into such a potent medicine it was referred to as being able to heal broken bones. The earliest reference would come from none other than Herodotus, with reference to some embalming their dead with honey. But when it comes directly to the mellified men, it appears in Chinese medical texts, which have some of the oldest documented medical records as well as the longest standing practices of medicinal cannibalism. The mellification process would often start before the individual's death. Once an individual decided to become a mellified man, they would only consume honey and absolutely nothing else. Even tales stating that these men would only sweat and defecate honey from how much they consumed and how there was nothing else in their system. And of course, eating only honey is not viable for humans, so ultimately these men would die from the diet or, more often than not, pre-existing ailments in conjunction with it, because most people that chose to be mellified men were already at the end of their life, so it kind of was this part of like, I'm gonna die anyway, let me help others. Mao flesh banquets. This is in reference to the Gongjai massacre that we've already discussed. It's more specifically dinners held where people were consumed, once again, as we talked about in the Mengshin County entry. Human drugs in Benako Gangmu. This is once right back again to Chinese medicinal cannibalism. It's an encyclopedia gathering of medicine, natural history, and Chinese herbology, published during the Ming Dynasty, and it's still considered a traditional physician reference book. But in its last section, it contains the human medicine portion, with about 35 entries, ranging from tears, hair, to internal organs and mummies to be consumed in various means for various cures, such as listing saying, for difficult labor, 14 hairs from the husband, ashed and taken with lard in the form of a pill. Skull bone is good for treating several tuberculosis-like diseases that are supposedly caused by evil spirits, and as I mentioned a few times before in this video, the reference to human flesh helping cure leprosy. Many of these entries have reference to spirits causing diseases, and this starts the aspect of medical cannibalism practice that it is in fact a ritual practice or even a sort of sympathetic magic. Holocaust cannibalism. Many survivors of concentration camps in the Holocaust have said that they or others were forced to partake in cannibalism in a means of survival. There is no official document of the occurrence, but with the amount of survivors' first-hand accounts of it happening, it leaves little to no doubt that some, in the horrors they were living, were forced to then consume those around them. USSR Cannibal Island. The mass deportation of around 6,700 prisoners beginning in May of 1933. They were left with little to no supplies and no tools or shelter. It was essentially a death sentence, and within 13 weeks, over 4,000 of them had died or disappeared. and the majority of the survivors were extremely sick, and those who attempted to leave were killed by armed guards that were terrorizing the men. By late May, all of this culminated to cannibalism becoming widespread, to the point that settlers eventually began murdering individuals for the sole purpose of consuming them. And on May 21st, the 3 health officers counted 70 new deaths, with signs of cannibalism observed in 5 cases. Over the next month, guards arrested about 50 people for cannibalism. The project came to an end in early June when Soviet authorities dissolved the settlement, and the surviving 2,856 deportees were transferred to smaller settlements. The events that occurred at Nazino Island highlighted issues with Soviet colonization projects, and the Soviet leadership began to doubt their quality and efficiency. The Red Market is the title of a book written by a journalist in reference to the underground body trade. Now, this goes beyond body brokers and organ brokers, which we're going to do a separate video on that because it is a very extensive practice. But this actually goes far past, scary stories of ending up in motel bathroom tubs full of ice and missing your kidney. The illegal body trade of organs, blood, bones, beings, hair, everything you can get off a person is a very, very real one. In particular, for his studies in this book, he actually references the 2004 Indian tsunami refugee camp that was nicknamed Kidneyville because of the amount of women that were selling off their kidneys to organ brokers for money for survival for themselves and their families. If you made it all the way to the end of this monstrous video with me, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I can't believe you sat here and watched this. Frankly, I can't believe I sat here and filmed this much with you. And definitely the state of fatigue I'm in. A lot of these were some pretty heavy hitters and a lot of stuff we haven't talked about. So I would like you to comment down below which one shocked you the most, intrigued you the most, one you didn't know the most, any of the above. Just, let's talk about cannibalism down below as somehow always. Once again, sharing my videos is awesome. Members get to see the videos early, so if you want to see videos early, the link is down below. There's actually a few entries I was a little shocked weren't mentioned, like Army Hammers techs or a lot of plane crashes that partook in cannibalism, but you can only put so much in an iceberg, and goddamn did we talk a lot today. This is probably gonna be the longest video I think I ever make in my entire online career. Follow me on all social media. I'm Darby Valentine. They are all linked down below. Make sure to follow me on TikTok. I go live regularly, and on Instagram I post about video updates and all things of the sort, and I look really good on the main grid, so make sure you're following me there as well. Merch is down below. Thanks for buying merch. There is going to be new merch designs dropping currently, or as this, I don't know. There's new merch, so, go check the merch out. As always, once again, thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing. Make sure to do all of those things. And with that, if you liked this video, you'd probably like my video about a deep dive into cannibalism. I will see you next time. I'm Darby. Bye.